My parents worshipped my sister. When I revealed my pregnancy at their anniversary dinner, my mother lunged across the table and physically struck my stomach. "The first grandchild must be hers," she screamed. "Get rid of the mistake." My father then threatened to ruin my career completely, unaware that the man who just rang the doorbell was about to expose a secret that would bankrupt them all. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect yourself from a toxic family. My name is Felicity, and at 33 years old, I finally learned that blood means absolutely nothing when money and status are on the line. To understand the absolute chaos of that night, you have to understand the dynamic of my family. I grew up in a massive cold estate in Connecticut, where my parents Barbara and Howard measured a person's worth entirely by their bank account and their willingness to submit to their control. My younger sister Brittany, who was 30, was the undisputed golden child. She was vain, manipulative, and perfectly molded in my mother's image. While I spent my youth studying and working to build a future, Brittany spent hers demanding luxury cars, designer bags, and endless attention. The night everything shattered was supposed to be a celebration. It was my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. They had rented out the private dining room of their exclusive country club, a space dripping in crystal chandeliers, heavy mahogany paneling, and the suffocating scent of expensive floral arrangements. The guest list was small, just immediate family. There was my father Howard puffing out his chest at the head of the table, my mother Barbara wearing a diamond necklace that cost more than my first college tuition. Brittany sat to my right, clutching the hand of her husband Trent. Trent was 33, a perpetually smug man who ran a tech startup that my father constantly bragged about to his wealthy friends. And then there was me sitting quietly beside my fiercely supportive husband Connor. In my family's eyes, Connor and I were the massive disappointments. My parents firmly believed that because I had chosen a degree in mathematics over high society networking, I was a failure. They thought I worked as a low-level bookkeeping clerk in a dusty back office. They treated Connor, who came from a modest, hard-working background, with barely concealed disdain. We were only invited to these dinners so my parents could use us as a contrast to highlight Brittany and Trent's supposed fabulous success. The first 3 courses of the dinner had been an exhausting exercise in biting my tongue. Brittany had spent an hour loudly complaining about her expensive fertility treatments, dabbing at her dry eyes with a linen napkin while my mother coddled her. Trent had droned on about his brilliant new app and how he was revolutionizing the tech logistics industry. Connor and I exchanged tired, knowing glances, simply waiting for the appropriate time to share our own news. We thought a new life, a baby, might actually bring a moment of genuine joy to this heavily scripted evening. When the waiter approached to pour the vintage champagne for the anniversary toast, I smiled and politely placed my hand over the rim of my crystal flute. I asked for sparkling water instead. My mother frowned, her perfectly manicured eyebrows drawing together in immediate annoyance. She asked why I was being difficult and ruining the aesthetic of the toast. Connor reached under the table and squeezed my hand encouragingly. I took a deep breath, looking around the table with a genuine smile. "Connor and I actually have some wonderful news to share tonight," I said, my voice filled with an excitement I could not contain. "We are 4 months pregnant. We are going to have a baby." I waited for the cheers. I waited for the sudden gasp of joy, the congratulations, the warmth that normal families share. Instead, the temperature in the dining room plummeted. A chilling, heavy silence fell over the mahogany table. No one moved. No one smiled. Howard stared at me, as if I had just announced a death in the family. Then the silence was shattered by a loud, sharp noise. Brittany slammed her heavy crystal glass down onto the table, the expensive champagne spilling over the edge and staining the white linen tablecloth. Her face contorted into a mask of absolute fury. Within seconds, she began to hyperventilate, forcing loud theatrical sobs that echoed off the paneled walls. "How could you do this to me?" Brittany wailed, pointing a shaking diamond-clad finger directly at my face. You know I have been going through a devastating 5-year infertility battle. You know how much pain I am in. You planned this just to mock me. You timed this pregnancy specifically to rub your fertility in my face. I sat there entirely paralyzed by the sheer absurdity of her accusation. Brittany, what are you talking about? I asked, my voice dropping to a shocked whisper. We have been trying for a baby for 2 years. This has nothing to do with you. This is our child. But logic and truth had no place in that room. My mother, Barbara, leapt to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. Her face was flushed dark red with unhinged rage. She did not look at me like a mother looking at her pregnant daughter. She looked at me like I was a diseased animal that had wandered into her pristine home. You malicious, selfish little brat! Barbara screamed, her voice echoing shrilly in the private room. Without a single second of hesitation, my mother lunged across the wide mahogany table. She grabbed her heavy brass-buckled designer purse by the straps and swung it with all her might, directly toward my lower stomach. The movement was so fast, so violently unhinged, that time seemed to slow down. I gasped and threw my arms over my belly, shrinking back into my chair. But Connor was faster. He shot up from his seat, moving with protective instinct. He intercepted the heavy purse with his forearm, taking the brutal impact himself. He then placed both hands on my mother's shoulders and shoved her hard backward, sending her stumbling back into the edge of the table. Do not ever touch my wife again! Connor roared, stepping directly between me and my mother. His fists clenched at his sides. If you come near her, I will have you arrested for assault. Barbara regained her balance, her chest heaving, completely unapologetic for attempting to harm her own unborn grandchild. She pointed a trembling finger around Connor to glare at me. The first grandchild must be hers. My mother screamed, her voice shaking the glass fixtures. Brittany deserves the first baby. You are stealing her moment. Get rid of the mistake. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Get rid of the mistake. My own mother was demanding I terminate a perfectly healthy, deeply wanted pregnancy simply because it inconvenienced her golden child's spotlight. I felt a cold, hard knot of absolute disgust solidify in my chest. Any lingering hope I had ever harbored for my parents' approval vanished in that exact second, replaced by a crystalline clinical fury. Before I could even process the horror of my mother's demand, my father Howard slammed both of his fists onto the table. He stood up, puffing his chest out, trying to intimidate Connor into backing down. He pointed at the door, his face a mask of authoritarian rage. You get out of this club right now! Howard yelled, his spittle flying across the expensive dinner plates. You have always been a spiteful, jealous failure, Felicity. You ruin everything. Just like when you refused to co-sign the loan for your sister's destination wedding and made us drain our retirement accounts to give her the day she deserved. You owe her this spotlight. You owe this family some respect. I stood up slowly, stepping out from behind Connor. I smoothed down the front of my maternity dress, my hands steady, my mind racing with absolute clarity. I do not owe this family a single dime or a single second of my life. I said, my voice dangerously calm, cutting through his yelling. You chose to drain your retirement for a $150,000 party. That was your terrible financial decision, not mine. Howard sneered at me, his eyes full of pure contempt. You think you are so smart because you play with spreadsheets all day, he spat, referencing the fake career he believed I had. Let me tell you something, you ungrateful little clerk. I play golf with the managing partners of your accounting firm. I'm going to call them first thing tomorrow morning. I will tell them you are violently unstable. You will be unemployed and completely unemployable by Monday morning. You and your nobody husband will be out on the street. He was breathing heavily, waiting for me to break down and beg for my job. He expected me to cry, to apologize, to grovel for his mercy. Instead, I just looked at him with a quiet, terrifying calm. Before I could deliver my response, the heavy oak double doors of the private dining room swung open. The sudden movement caught everyone off guard. It was not the country club manager coming to quiet us down. It was not the police. Standing in the doorway was a tall, sharply dressed man holding a thick manila folder. It was Thomas, the high-profile private investigator Connor and I had hired several months ago. I had contracted him to audit some highly suspicious financial leaks involving my parents' estate and Trent's so-called booming tech startup. Thomas ignored my father's immediate sputtering demands to leave the private room. He walked with total composure straight to where I was standing. He did not say a word to my parents. He simply handed the thick, heavily sealed folder to me and stepped back, crossing his arms and standing guard near the door. I took the folder, the weight of it heavy with undeniable truth. I looked at my mother, who was still breathing hard, her hands gripping the edge of the table. I looked at Brittany, who had miraculously stopped her fake sobbing to stare at the mysterious man in the doorway. I tossed the manila folder directly onto the center of the mahogany table right over the spilled champagne. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. "Mom," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the stunned silence of the room. "Before you assault me for ruining Courtney's miracle baby, you should probably read the medical files in that folder." Brittany's face instantly went chalk white. She lunged forward to grab the folder, but Trent beat her to it, picking it up with a confused frown. "Brittany isn't infertile," I continued, speaking loud enough for every single person in the room to hear. "She secretly had an elective tubal ligation 6 years ago because she did not want to ruin her figure. The devastating IVF treatments she has been crying about tonight are a complete fabrication. She has been milking you and Dad for $250,000 in fake medical expenses." I turned my cold gaze directly to my mother, watching the blood completely drain from her face as her jaw went slack. "And you knew about it the entire time, didn't you, Mom?" I asked, stepping closer to the table. "You helped her launder the money to fund her luxury shopping addiction, and you hid the massive bank withdrawals from Dad." Thomas stood on the porch with the crisp autumn air rolling into the stifling dining room behind him. He did not look like a man who had accidentally interrupted an intimate family gathering. He wore a sharp charcoal suit and carried himself with the absolute certainty of a professional who had just cornered his prey. Howard stepped forward instantly, his chest puffed out and his face a mask of purple fury. He demanded to know who the hell Thomas was and how he had gotten past the neighborhood security gate. He threatened to call the police and press charges for trespassing if Thomas did not turn around and walk away that very second. Thomas did not even blink. He ignored my father completely. He stepped smoothly into the foyer, his polished shoes silent on the expensive hardwood floors, and walked directly toward the dining table. He carried a thick manila folder that looked heavy with undisputed facts. With a deliberate and practiced motion, Thomas dropped the folder right onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a loud smack next to the spilled vintage champagne. He then took a single step back, crossed his arms, and stood guard near the entryway. I adjusted my maternity coat, feeling a wave of absolute ice-cold clarity wash over me. I looked at my mother. Barbara was trembling uncontrollably. All the arrogant rage had drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. She stared at the manila folder as if it were a ticking bomb. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, "before Mom tries to assault me again for ruining Courtney's so-called miracle, I highly suggest you open that folder. You need to read the medical and financial records inside." Barbara lunged for the table. She scrambled to grab the folder before my father could reach it, her heavy diamond bracelets clinking against the wood. "Do not touch that," she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure panic. "It is garbage. It is lies. Felicity is just trying to ruin our anniversary because she is a jealous, spiteful girl. Howard, throw them out right now." But Connor stepped forward and firmly planted his hand over the folder, blocking Barbara from snatching it. His presence was an immovable wall. Howard looked at his wife, clearly confused by her sudden, desperate panic. His brow furrowed. He pushed Connor's hand aside, picked up the folder, and ripped open the metal clasp. The dining room descended into a suffocating silence as my father began to read the top document. It was a certified medical summary legally obtained by Thomas's agency during a deep-dive background check we had initiated months ago. I watched Howard's eyes scan the page. I watched his confusion morph into a deep, sickening realization. "Let me save you the trouble of translating the medical jargon, Dad," I said, stepping closer to the table. "Courtney is not infertile. She never has been. She has been lying to your face for 5 years." Courtney let out a sharp gasp and covered her mouth. Trent. Her husband dropped his napkin and stared at her in total shock. 6 years ago, I continued, my voice ringing out clearly in the dead silent room. Courtney checked herself into a private clinic in Beverly Hills. She underwent an elective bilateral tubal ligation. She permanently and voluntarily had her tubes tied. Do you want to know why she did it, Dad? Because she told her doctors on the record that she refused to ever get pregnant. She said carrying a child would ruin her perfect figure and destroy her social life. Howard's hands began to shake as he flipped to the second page, seeing the undeniable signatures, the clinic letterheads, and the dates matching exactly what I was saying. The devastating IVF treatments she has been crying about tonight, the endless hormonal injections, the tragic miscarriages she claimed to have suffered, I said, leaning in. It was all a complete fabrication. She never set foot inside a fertility clinic for treatment. She manufactured an entire fake medical tragedy to milk you out of $250,000 in supposed medical expenses. Courtney scrambled backward, knocking her chair over. She pressed herself against the dining room wall, looking frantically at Trent, who was now staring at her with pure disgust. But the truth was not done spilling out. I turned my gaze back to my mother, who was clutching her chest and breathing in short, shallow gasps. "And you knew about it the entire time, didn't you, Mom?" I asked coldly. Howard slowly lowered the medical files. His eyes fell upon the next stack of papers in the folder. These were bank statements, meticulously highlighted financial ledgers tracing the flow of Howard's hard-earned money. "Look at the highlighted transfers, Dad," I instructed. "You thought you were writing checks directly to a world-renowned fertility specialist in Manhattan. But if you look at the routing numbers, that money never went to a clinic. Mom set up a shell account under a fake LLC. She intercepted the checks you wrote for Courtney's medical care and deposited them directly into a joint account she shares with her golden child." Howard stared at the bank logs, his face turning an ashen gray. He was reading the itemized credit card statements Thomas had compiled. "They did not spend your money on IVF rounds," I said, my tone relentless. "They used your $250,000 to fund their luxury shopping addictions. That purse Mom just tried to hit my unborn child with, that was bought with your money." On the exact same day, Courtney claimed she lost her second fake baby. The trips to Paris, the designer shoes, the endless spa weekends. Mom helped her launder every single penny. She actively hid the massive withdrawals from you so they could play the role of the grieving mother and the supportive grandmother while treating your bank account like a personal ATM. The evidence was absolute. There was no room for denial. Howard looked at his wife. Barbara was weeping now, shaking her head and taking a step back as Howard slowly stood up from his chair. "Howard, please," Barbara whimpered, holding her hands up. "It is not what it looks like." Courtney was depressed. She needed cheering up. "You work so much, you do not understand the pressure we are under to maintain our image in this community. I was just helping our daughter cope." "You stole $250,000 from my retirement fund to buy handbags," Howard bellowed, his voice vibrating with a rage so intense the crystal glasses on the table rattled. "You lied to my face for 5 years." For a fraction of a second, I thought my father was finally going to hold them accountable. I thought the lifetime of favoritism, the endless passes given to Courtney, and the toxic enabling from my mother were finally going to shatter right there in the dining room. I expected him to throw them out. I expected him to demand his money back. I expected justice. But I had underestimated the absolute depths of my father's toxic pride. Howard was a man who cared about his image above all else. He cared about being the smartest, most powerful man in the room. Realizing that his own wife and his golden child had easily conned him out of a fortune shattered his ego. He could not accept that he had been played for a fool. He could not process the humiliation of being the victim of his own family's scam. So his mind did what it had always done when reality became too uncomfortable. He projected the blame onto the scapegoat. He projected it onto me. Howard whipped his head around his eyes, locking onto me with a terrifying, irrational hatred. He slammed the manila folder back onto the table. "How dare you!" he screamed, marching toward me until Connor stepped firmly in his path. How dare you bring this filth into my home? I stared at him in genuine disbelief. Dad, they stole $250,000 from you. They faked a medical tragedy to rob you blind. I do not care about the money. Howard roared, his face mere inches from Connor's shoulder. You hired a private investigator to spy on your own family. You illegally invaded our privacy. You dug through our personal medical files and bank accounts just to satisfy your sick, twisted jealousy. You could not handle the fact that we love your sister, so you spent months plotting to destroy our anniversary dinner. You are a sociopath, Felicity. I felt a cold laugh escape my throat. The mental gymnastics required to blame me for their fraud were staggering. You are actually defending them, I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. They conned you, and you are mad at me for showing you the proof. You are dead to me. Howard spat, entirely ignoring the reality of the situation to protect his shattered ego. You think you have won. You think you can walk into my house, disrespect my wife, humiliate your sister, and get away with it. Let me promise you something right now. I know the CEO of the accounting firm where you work. I play golf with the board of directors. I am going to call them first thing on Monday morning. Howard was practically foaming at the mouth, emboldened by his own delusion. I am going to tell them that you are a violent, unstable liability. I am going to pull every single one of my corporate accounts from their firm unless they fire you on the spot. I will personally ensure you are blacklisted from every financial institution in this state. You are going to be completely unemployable. He pointed a shaking finger at my stomach. You and your nobody husband are going to be bankrupt by Monday. You are going to lose your cheap little apartment, and you are going to be begging on the streets with that mistake in your belly. Do you hear me? I will ruin you. I looked at my father, a man so poisoned by his own pride that he would rather destroy his innocent daughter than admit his golden child was a fraud. I looked at my mother, who had stopped crying and was now standing behind Howard, a smug, vindictive smirk returning to her face as she realized my father was protecting her. And I looked at Courtney, who was staring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. Connor took my hand. His grip was warm and steady. Are we done here? He asked me quietly. I nodded, turning my back on the people who had made my life a misery for 3 decades. Yes, I said. We are completely done. We walked out of the dining room past Thomas, who was holding the front door open for us. I did not look back as we stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy door clicking shut behind us. I felt no sorrow. I felt no heartbreak. Howard thought he had issued a death sentence to my career. He thought he was going to destroy a mid-level bookkeeping clerk. He had absolutely no idea who he had just threatened. The drive away from the country club was a blur of streetlights and Connor's white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel. The silence in the car was heavy with the aftermath of my family's explosive delusion. My hands remained tightly cradled over my lower stomach, guarding the tiny life inside me. The moment we reached the emergency room, the triage nurses took one look at my pale face and rushed me straight back. The sterile scent of rubbing alcohol and bleached floors grounded me in reality as the ultrasound technicians squeezed warm gel onto my skin. Connor held his breath, his jaw tight with suppressed rage, until the rhythmic galloping sound of a strong fetal heartbeat filled the small exam room. Our baby was perfectly healthy. The heavy designer purse had only grazed my hip bone thanks to Connor's quick reflexes. But the sheer intent behind my mother's violence left a permanent icy void where my daughterly affection used to be. We were sitting in the fluorescent-lit discharge waiting area when my phone began to vibrate violently against the plastic armrest of my chair. It was not a single notification. It was a continuous, aggressive buzzing that signaled a digital avalanche. I unlocked the screen to find 53 new text messages, 20 missed calls, and an endless stream of social media tags. Connor leaned over my shoulder, his protective instincts flaring, as I opened the first link sent by my Aunt Susan. It directed me straight to Brittany's public page. There she was on the screen, sitting in the passenger seat of her husband Spencer's luxury SUV. Her makeup was expertly smudged to look like she had been crying for hours. She stared directly into the camera, letting out a jagged practice sob before launching into her fabricated tragedy. She told her 40,000 followers that she had just survived a horrific family dinner. With trembling lips, she spun a tale of pure fiction, claiming that I had viciously attacked her at the table out of pure jealousy over her medical struggles. She completely inverted reality. According to her narrative, I was a deeply unstable, bitter sister who could not handle seeing her overcome infertility and had violently assaulted her to ruin her anniversary toast. She even held up a bruised wrist, an injury she probably gave herself in the country club parking lot, claiming Connor had to physically drag me out of the building to save her life. The comments beneath the video were a sickening echo chamber of support for her and absolute vitriol for me. My inbox was a war zone. Extended family members who had not spoken to me in years were suddenly crawling out of the woodwork to condemn me based entirely on a heavily edited video. My uncle David texted that I was a disgrace to the family name and needed immediate psychiatric help. My cousin Rebecca left a scathing voicemail telling me I was dead to the entire extended family and that I deserved whatever misery came my way. They all swallowed Brittany's performance without a single question. It was the exact same dynamic that had governed my entire life. Brittany played the wounded victim and the family blindly rallied to crucify me. Then a direct message from Brittany popped onto my screen. This one was not meant for public consumption. It was a private, venomous gloat. "I told you I would make you pay," the text read. "You think you are so superior just because you did not need Dad's money to get through college. I am going to make sure you lose absolutely everything tonight. Just like you made me lose my spot as sorority president when you refused to write my final term papers. You owe me a life, Felicity." I stared at those words, the sheer audacity of her entitlement washing over me. 5 years ago, when she was failing her senior year classes, she demanded I do her coursework so she could focus on her social climbing and party planning. When I flatly refused, she failed out of her leadership position and blamed me for ruining her life. She had harbored that petty, ridiculous grudge for half a decade, waiting for the perfect moment to exact her revenge. She honestly believed that destroying my reputation online would bring me to my knees and force me to beg for forgiveness. While I was reading Brittany's message, an email notification dropped into my inbox. It was from the executive assistant at the mid-level accounting firm where my parents firmly believed I worked as a basic data entry clerk. The subject line was flagged as urgent. The assistant had attached a voicemail left on the general company inbox just 10 minutes prior. I tapped play, holding the phone to my ear. It was my father. Howard's voice was slurred with rage and expensive scotch. He was demanding to speak to the CEO immediately. He loudly declared that I was a violent, unstable liability who had just assaulted a family member unprovoked. He threatened to pull all of his lucrative corporate accounts and ensure his country club associates did the same unless I was terminated without severance by Monday morning. He sounded so incredibly smug, so certain of his ultimate power over my livelihood. Connor watched my face as the voicemail ended. He expected me to be upset, to panic over the orchestrated destruction of my character and career. He put a comforting hand on my knee, ready to reassure me that we would survive this. Instead, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I locked my phone and stood up, feeling stronger than I had ever felt in my entire life. "Let them post their videos," I said to Connor, wrapping my coat around my shoulders. "Let Dad make his angry phone calls. They are playing checkers on a board they do not even own." My family thought I was a defenseless, easily crushed clerk, living paycheck to paycheck. They thought I was entirely reliant on the meager salary of a job Howard could destroy with one phone call. They were completely unaware of the empire I had quietly and ruthlessly built over the last decade. But my power extended far beyond my own employment. My team had spent the last 3 months executing a highly strategic maneuver. We had been quietly buying up the corporate debt of Spencer Brittany's husband, who ran a supposedly booming tech logistics startup. Spencer's company was actively bleeding money, and the bank holding their primary mortgages and massive business loans had just been acquired by Apex Capital. My family was celebrating my supposed downfall, entirely oblivious to the fact that I held their entire financial existence in the palm of my hand. The drive home from the hospital was remarkably peaceful. The frantic energy of the night had settled into a cold, calculated strategy. The moment we walked through the door of our apartment, I bypassed the flood of toxic family emails on my personal phone and opened my encrypted corporate laptop. Right at the top of the screen was a message forwarded from my lead acquisitions director at Apex. It was an urgent, desperate plea marked high priority. Spencer and my father had formally requested an emergency bailout meeting with Apex Capital's anonymous CEO. They needed a massive bridge loan to prevent immediate foreclosure on their properties, offering my parents' estate as collateral. They were begging for a lifeline, completely unaware that they were about to walk straight into my boardroom. We drove away from the hospital in total silence, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the wet pavement acting as a grounding force. Connor did not take the highway exit that led back to our modest two-bedroom apartment. That apartment was a carefully maintained prop, a place we lived in simply to keep my parents comfortable in their delusion that I was struggling. Instead, Connor drove straight toward the towering glass skyscrapers of the downtown financial district. We pulled into a highly secure private underground parking garage beneath the tallest building on the block. I scanned my biometric keycard at the private elevator, and the heavy metal doors slid shut, sealing us off from the chaos of the night. When the silver doors opened on the 50th floor, we stepped into my actual reality. For a decade, my family had taken immense twisted pleasure in believing I was an absolute failure. They mocked my supposed life as a low-level bookkeeping clerk. My father, Howard, loved to tell his country club friends that I spent my days hunched over a cheap desk, crunching meaningless numbers for men far smarter than me. Brittany frequently joked that my salary barely covered her monthly shoe budget. The truth, however, was something they could never have comprehended. I was not a mid-level clerk. I was the sole founder and managing partner of Apex Capital Partners. I had built a ruthless, highly successful private equity firm that specialized in distressed corporate acquisitions. We bought failing empires, stripped them down, identified the fraud, and turned massive profits. I commanded billions of dollars in assets, and my name was whispered with fear and respect in boardrooms across the country. I walked into my expansive corner office, my heels silent on the plush carpet. The room was surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the glittering city skyline. I sat behind my massive marble desk, opened my encrypted corporate laptop, and logged into the secure executive terminal. I immediately pulled up the audio file that the executive assistant at the accounting firm had forwarded to me. It was the voicemail from my father. I played it on speaker. Howard's voice filled my elegant office, slurred with rage and expensive scotch. He was aggressively demanding to speak to the CEO. He loudly declared that I was a violent, unstable liability who had assaulted a family member unprovoked. He threatened to pull all of his lucrative corporate accounts and ensure his wealthy associates did the same unless I was terminated without severance by Monday morning. He sounded so incredibly smug, so absolutely certain of his ultimate power over my livelihood. I listened to the voicemail and felt a cold, hard smile form on my lips. Howard genuinely believed he had the power to snap his fingers and end my career. What my arrogant father did not know was that the accounting firm he was currently threatening was just a tiny, insignificant subsidiary of Apex Capital. I had acquired that specific firm 3 years ago to restructure their local corporate tax division. The CEO Howard had demanded to speak to was a man I had personally hired and trained. My father was barking orders and making empty threats at a company that I owned completely. His angry phone call resulted in absolutely nothing because his target was the person signing the paychecks. Connor poured us both the glass of sparkling water from the office wet bar and took a seat across from me. He placed my personal phone on the marble desk. The screen was still lighting up like a casino slot machine. The social media smear campaign Brittany had launched was operating at maximum velocity. She was relentlessly texting me screenshots of the vile, hateful comments her followers were leaving on her fake, tearful video. She told me I was going to rot in a jail cell for assaulting a poor, defenseless woman who was suffering from medical trauma. She completely ignored the fact that she was the one who had faked her entire infertility history and stolen $250,000 from our parents. Brittany sent another message gloating that she was going to make sure I lost absolutely everything. She boasted that this was her ultimate revenge for the time I refused to write her senior year term papers, which had cost her the presidency of her college sorority. She was still holding a grudge over a college club from 10 years ago, and she genuinely thought this viral video was her masterstroke. My mother, Barbara, chimed in right after sending a long, vicious text declaring that I was a monster, that I was dead to her, and that my father was already contacting his lawyers to ensure I was left bankrupt and completely isolated. Connor read the messages over my shoulder. His jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle jumping in his cheek. He asked if I wanted our legal team to draft an immediate cease and desist order. He wanted to deploy our corporate lawyers to crush them for the stress they were putting on me and our unborn child. He wanted to shut down Brittany's social media accounts and sue for defamation. But I shook my head, placing a calming hand over his. Responding with anger or legal threats was exactly what they wanted. They thrived on dramatic reactions. They wanted to see me scramble, cry, and beg for mercy. I was not going to give them a single drop of emotion. I was going to give them absolute financial ruin. I turned my attention away from the petty text messages and pulled up a highly secure set of files on my monitor. These were not social media posts or angry voicemails. These were deep, comprehensive corporate ledgers. For the past 8 months, my forensic acquisitions team had been quietly and meticulously investigating Spencer, Brittany's husband. Spencer ran a tech logistics startup that my parents treated like the ultimate success story. Howard constantly bragged about Spencer's brilliant entrepreneurial mind, comparing his supposed massive wealth to Connor's hardworking, modest background. Brittany paraded around town acting like the wife of a tech billionaire. The reality of Spencer's business, however, was a spectacular, unmitigated disaster. The ledgers on my screen painted a picture of systemic incompetence and extreme financial desperation. Spencer's tech logistics company was bleeding capital at an astonishing, unsustainable rate. He had terrible client retention, massive overhead costs, and a bloated executive payroll that made absolutely no sense for a company of that size. To keep up the facade of extreme wealth for Brittany to fund her luxury cars, the country club memberships, and the designer clothes, Spencer had been taking out massive high-interest corporate loans. He had leveraged absolutely everything to the hilt, including the primary mortgages on their commercial properties and their own private residence. Spencer had not just ruined his own life. To secure his latest round of desperate funding, he had convinced Howard to act as a personal guarantor. My father, blinded by his absolute favoritism and his desperate need to be associated with tech success, had quietly put up the family estate and a massive chunk of his remaining stock portfolio as collateral for Spencer's business loans. Howard had risked his own secure retirement to prop up a man who was running a shell game. Instead of getting angry at my family, I simply activated my financial trap. 3 weeks ago, Apex Capital had executed a highly strategic maneuver. We quietly purchased the regional bank that held all of Spencer's primary corporate debt. Through a series of complex, untraceable subsidiary acquisitions, I had silently become the primary debt holder of my brother-in-law's entire failing empire. Every single loan, every commercial mortgage, every desperate line of credit that kept Spencer and Brittany afloat was now legally controlled by my firm. Now that Apex Capital owned that debt, I held the deed to my parents' mansion right alongside Spencer's worthless company. My forensic accountants had already found exactly what we needed. Spencer had violated several major covenants of those loans by misappropriating corporate funds to pay for his personal lifestyle. Because he broke the strict terms of those agreements, I had the legal right to call in the debt immediately. I typed a quick, decisive message to my chief financial officer, instructing him to tighten the net and prepare the notices of default. The trap was fully set and ready to spring. My family sat in their expensive homes drinking champagne and celebrating my supposed downfall. They believed they were launching a successful, devastating war to ruin a helpless bookkeeping clerk. They thought I was defenseless. They were completely blind to the fact that they were standing directly on a massive financial landmine that I had already triggered. I sat back in my heavy leather chair, taking a slow sip of water, and watched the taillights of the Seattle traffic moving far below my window. I placed a hand on my stomach, feeling a profound sense of peace. I was finally removing this toxic rot from my life forever. Just then, a distinct chime echoed from my computer speakers. A high-priority email had landed directly in the secure inbox reserved exclusively for the anonymous CEO of Apex Capital. I clicked it open, my eyes scanning the subject line. It was a formal, desperate application for an emergency bridge loan. The applicants were Spencer and my father Howard. They were begging Apex Capital for a massive multi-million-dollar bailout to prevent the immediate foreclosure of Spencer's company and the seizure of my parents' personal estate. They were completely unaware that the anonymous billionaire they were pleading with for their absolute survival was the exact same daughter they had just tried to violently erase from the family. The ink on their electronic bailout application was barely dry when my doorbell rang the following morning. Connor and I were sitting in the small kitchen of the modest two-bedroom apartment we maintained specifically to keep my family completely in the dark about our wealth. I opened the door to find a courier standing in the hallway holding a thick legal envelope. I signed for it, brought it to the kitchen island, and sliced it open with a butter knife. Inside was a formal cease and desist letter printed on the cheap, flimsy letterhead of a strip mall attorney. It was from Brittany. I read the document aloud to Connor, unable to keep the sheer amusement out of my voice. Unaware of who she was actually dealing with, Brittany was aggressively escalating her attacks. The letter formally accused me of intentional infliction of emotional distress and unprovoked physical assault. It demanded an immediate cash payment of $50,000 in punitive damages for the severe trauma I had allegedly caused her at the anniversary dinner. The attorney threatened that if the funds were not wire transferred into Brittany's account within 48 hours, they would take me to civil court, drag my name through the mud, and personally contact my employer to ensure my clerical career was completely ruined. She genuinely believed that $50,000 would bankrupt me. She thought the threat of a frivolous lawsuit would terrify a simple bookkeeping clerk into submission. She wanted me on my knees begging for a payment plan or crying for mercy. As I tossed the ridiculous legal threat into the recycling bin, my personal cell phone buzzed on the granite counter. It was a new voicemail from my mother. I put the phone on speaker so Connor could hear every word. Barbara's voice filled the small kitchen, dripping with her signature blend of condescension and fake magnanimity. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask about my pregnancy or the health of her unborn grandchild after she had violently swung a heavy designer purse at my stomach the night before. Instead, she got right to the point. She told me she had spoken to Brittany and Howard, and they had come up with a generous compromise to keep the family peace. If I simply paid the $50,000 without a fight and recorded a tearful public apology video to post on all my social media accounts, they would consider dropping the lawsuit. Barbara added that if my apology was sincere enough, and if I promised to behave, they might even let me sit at the far end of the table at future family holidays. The sheer delusion was staggering. My mother was treating me like a misbehaving child who needed to buy her way back into their good graces. She honestly thought she was offering me a generous lifeline. I looked at Connor. He was gripping his coffee mug so tightly, his knuckles were stark white. He asked me if I was going to let our corporate lawyers crush them for extortion and harassment. I shook my head, took a calm sip of my herbal tea, and smiled. I told him that arguing with them was entirely beneath me. I was not going to waste my breath exchanging petty insults with people who were already standing on the gallows. I grabbed my car keys and my leather briefcase. It was time to go to work. When I walked into the soaring glass lobby of Apex Capital Partners, the security team tipped their heads in silent respect. I bypassed the standard elevators and took the private executive lift straight to the top floor. My core legal and financial teams were already assembled in the main boardroom, waiting for my directives. They had the massive glowing monitors projected with every single financial detail of Spencer's failing tech logistics startup. They had mapped out the entire web of his corporate debt, his high-interest loans, and the toxic commercial mortgages he had secured using my parents' estate as collateral. I took my seat at the head of the long mahogany table and looked at my lead acquisitions director. I told him to reject the bailout application Spencer and Howard had submitted the night before, but not to decline it outright. Instead, I instructed my legal team to send a terrifying and aggressive response directly to Spencer's corporate headquarters. We were going to issue a formal notice of default on his existing loans. My lawyers drafted the document with ruthless precision. The notice informed Spencer that Apex Capital had recently acquired his primary debt portfolios from his original lenders. It explicitly stated that our preliminary risk assessment had identified severe irregularities and potential covenant breaches in his financial reporting. The document laid out a stark, uncompromising ultimatum. Apex Capital demanded an immediate full-scale forensic audit of his company ledgers. We required unrestricted remote access to every bank statement, every vendor invoice, and every offshore wire transfer he had made in the last 3 years. The notice clearly stated that absolutely no bailout negotiations would even be entertained until our internal auditors had scrubbed his entire operation clean. If he refused the audit, we would initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings and seize all his commercial assets by the end of the week. We sent the notice via certified corporate courier and secure email. I sat back in my heavy leather chair and watched the clock, knowing exactly how this psychological warfare was going to play out. Spencer was a man drowning in his own manufactured reality. He had spent years pretending to be a brilliant tech visionary, soaking up the adoration of my father, and funding Brittany's insatiable appetite for luxury. He was absolutely terrified of losing his high society status. If his company went under, the facade would completely shatter. Brittany would discover that her billionaire husband was actually broke, and Howard would realize that the son-in-law he worshipped had gambled away the family estate on a sinking ship. Within 2 hours, my office phone rang with an update from my lead director. The panic on Spencer's end had been instantaneous and absolute. Upon receiving the notice of default, Spencer had frantically called the Apex Capital legal department, begging for an extension and pleading for a meeting with the executives. My lawyers, following my strict instructions, remained completely emotionless and denied every single request for leniency. They told him he had until the end of the business day to sign the audit compliance forms, or the foreclosure process would be formally triggered. Spencer was trapped in a cage of his own making. He could not tell Howard about the default notice because it would expose the fact that the company was already failing before the massive bailout was even approved. He definitely could not tell Brittany, who was currently busy shopping for designer clothes with the money she had stolen from my father's retirement fund. Spencer was utterly isolated in his desperation. Driven by pure panic and the desperate need to keep up his wealthy facade for just a little bit longer, he made the only choice he thought he had. Just before 5 o'clock, my director forwarded the signed compliance paperwork directly to my secure inbox. Spencer had caved completely. He officially agreed to the total forensic audit. He had voluntarily unlocked his corporate vault, granting my team complete and unrestricted access to every dark, fraudulent corner of his business. He signed away his rights to privacy, praying that if he just played along and opened his books, the anonymous CEO of Apex Capital would show him mercy and grant him the multi-million-dollar bailout he needed to survive. He was completely unaware that he had just handed his entire financial life, his future, and his absolute freedom over to the very same sister-in-law he had been mocking on social media just hours prior. I downloaded the massive data files Spencer provided and distributed them to my top forensic accountants. I gave them one simple, unforgiving directive. I told them to tear his company apart piece by piece, dollar by dollar. I wanted to know exactly where every cent of my father's money had gone. I wanted to see the hidden offshore accounts, the fake vendors, the fabricated invoices, and the gambling debts. I wanted the undeniable proof of his systemic fraud laid out in black and white, ready for the authorities. While my team went to work dissecting his life, I received another text message on my personal phone. It was Brittany again. She sent a picture of herself getting a luxury pedicure at an exclusive downtown spa, holding up a glass of expensive champagne. The caption read that she was enjoying the calm before the storm, warning me that the $50,000 deadline was rapidly approaching. She told me to start selling my cheap furniture because she was coming for everything I owned and would not stop until I was living on the street. I looked at the picture of my sister, so incredibly smug, so confident in her untouchable status. I locked my phone, turned back to the glowing monitors displaying the impending ruin of her husband's entire empire, and allowed myself a moment of pure, uninterrupted satisfaction. The storm was indeed coming to wipe them all out, but she had absolutely no idea who was bringing it. The forensic accounting team at Apex Capital operates with the ruthless surgical efficiency of a military strike unit. Within 48 hours of Spencer signing the compliance forms in a desperate bid to secure his bailout, my lead auditors had completely dismantled his corporate ledgers. I sat in my home office scrolling through the preliminary findings on my encrypted monitor and felt a chilling sense of vindication. Spencer's highly touted tech logistics startup was not just poorly managed, it was a staggering, deeply systematic fraud. He had constructed an elaborate shell game designed to deceive investors and bankroll an extravagant lifestyle. The company produced absolutely nothing of value. The massive revenue he constantly reported to his board consisted entirely of fabricated vendor invoices, ghost contracts, and circular wire transfers explicitly engineered to create the illusion of booming cash flow. He was leasing empty warehouse spaces across the state just to have physical addresses on paper. He had a bloated executive payroll filled with fake employees, allowing him to siphon hundreds of thousands of dollars into his personal accounts every single month. But the most horrifying discoveries lay hidden in the expense columns. Spencer was bleeding capital at a catastrophic, irreversible rate. He was not reinvesting the funds into the business or struggling with market downturns. He was deliberately funneling millions of dollars of investor money straight into offshore cryptocurrency gambling accounts. He had a severe, uncontrollable addiction, and he was using his company as a personal casino bankroll. My lead accountant flagged a specific series of wire transfers that made my blood run completely cold. 8 months ago, Spencer had received a massive lump sum deposit of $400,000. I cross-referenced the routing numbers and recognized the origin account immediately. It was my father's primary retirement fund. Howard had actually done it. Blinded by his absolute favoritism and his desperate need to be associated with a tech billionaire, my father had liquidated his life savings. He had taken the money he had spent 40 years accumulating and handed it directly to a con artist. Spencer had likely fed him a brilliant pitch about pre-IPO investment opportunities and guaranteed returns. But the audit logs showed the sickening reality. Within 3 weeks of receiving Howard's money, Spencer had wired every single cent of it to an untraceable gambling syndicate in the Cayman Islands. He had bet my father's entire future on digital roulette and lost it all. My father was currently defending the man who had robbed him blind, completely unaware that he was practically destitute. I sat back in my chair staring at the damning evidence glowing on the screen. Any normal daughter might have felt a pang of sympathy for her father's foolishness. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical resolve. Howard had just threatened to destroy my career to protect this exact man. He had allowed my mother to physically attack me to protect the image of this perfect family. I methodically downloaded the specific transaction logs, proving the theft of Howard's money. I printed a high-resolution color-coded screenshot of the offshore wire transfers, folded it neatly, and slid it into a blank, unmarked envelope. I sealed it tight. While I was compiling the rest of the legal dossier to trigger the final foreclosure, my personal cell phone buzzed with an incoming call from the front desk of my apartment building. Connor was at his architectural firm for the afternoon, leaving me alone in the modest two-bedroom unit we used exclusively to maintain our cover story. I answered the call to hear our usually stoic building manager sounding extremely distressed. He informed me that my sister had bypassed the outer security gate by tailgating a delivery truck and was currently in the main lobby causing an absolute uproar. He asked if he should call the police to have her removed for trespassing. I told him to hold off and that I would handle the situation personally. I walked out of my apartment, stepping into the elevator with the sealed envelope tucked safely into the pocket of my maternity cardigan. As the heavy metal doors slid open on the ground floor, the sound of Brittany's shrill, hysterical voice echoed off the marble walls. She was standing dead center in the lobby, flanked by two of my elderly neighbors who had merely stopped to check their mail. Brittany was putting on a masterclass in manipulation. Dressed head to toe in designer clothes bought with stolen money, she was gesturing wildly, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. She was loudly recounting the fabricated story of our anniversary dinner, aggressively trying to turn my own community against me. She cried to my horrified neighbors that I was a violently unhinged woman who had physically attacked her out of pure malicious jealousy. She told them I had tried to harm her miracle baby because I was a bitter, miserable clerk who hated seeing anyone else succeed. She pointed up toward my floor, screaming that I was a coward hiding in my cheap apartment, too terrified to face the righteous anger of my family. She warned the elderly couple that they were living next door to a dangerous sociopath. The neighbors looked deeply uncomfortable, taking cautious steps backward toward the exit as I slowly approached the gathering. Brittany spotted me walking across the lobby, and her fake theatrical tears instantly vanished. They were replaced by a triumphant, vicious sneer. She thought her public ambush had worked perfectly. She marched right up to me, jabbing her diamond-clad finger just inches from my face. She demanded to know why I had ignored her legal letter. She screamed that I owed her $50,000 for emotional distress and that she was not leaving this building until I wrote her a check and got on my knees to beg for her forgiveness. She loudly boasted that if I did not comply, she was going to call my accounting firm tomorrow and ensure I was fired for assault. She expected me to shrink back. She expected me to flush with embarrassment and desperately try to defend my character to the strangers watching us. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a single word of defense against her ridiculous, desperate lies. I remained completely still, letting her scream until she literally ran out of breath. The lobby fell into a tense, suffocating silence. I calmly reached into my pocket and pulled out the crisp white envelope. I held it out to her. Brittany stopped mid-rant, staring at the blank paper with deep suspicion. She snatched it out of my hand, her acrylic nails digging into the paper. She scoffed, asking me what kind of pathetic excuse or apology I had written down. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the lobby with absolute chilling precision. "There is no apology inside that envelope, Brittany," I said smoothly, ensuring my neighbors heard every word. "But before you demand another dime from me, I highly suggest you go home, show those documents to Spencer, and ask your husband exactly how much your perfect life is really worth." Brittany glared at me, aggressively ripping the envelope open. She pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. It was the itemized screenshot of Spencer's offshore wire transfers. I had specifically highlighted the massive $400,000 deposit from our father and the subsequent outgoing transfers to the crypto casino. I stood perfectly still and watched the arrogant, vindictive sneer melt completely off her face. The transformation was instantaneous. As her eyes darted across the highlighted banking logs, recognizing the account numbers and the devastating final balances, sudden, sickening comprehension washed over her. The color drained from her cheeks so fast she looked like a corpse. Her hands began to tremble violently, the paper shaking uncontrollably in her grip. She looked up at me, her mouth opening and closing, but she could not produce a single sound. The reality of her husband's absolute financial ruin had just crashed violently into her perfectly curated, stolen world. Without saying another word, Brittany crumpled the paper into her fist, turned on her designer heel, and sprinted out of the lobby doors in a blind, terrified panic. The lobby doors had barely swung shut behind Brittany's fleeing figure when my phone began to ring. I did not answer it. I simply rode the elevator back up to my apartment, relishing the absolute silence of my private space. Brittany was currently scrambling, her fabricated world crashing down around her expensive stolen designer shoes. She knew I had the financial records. She knew I held the undeniable proof of Spencer's offshore gambling addiction. I fully expected her to go into hiding to desperately try and spin a web of lies to protect herself from the inevitable crushing fallout. However, I severely underestimated her sheer unadulterated audacity. Instead of retreating, Brittany decided to double down on her delusions. If Spencer needed a massive influx of cash to survive the impending corporate audit and keep Apex Capital from seizing their assets, she was going to get it the only way she knew how. She was going to mercilessly exploit our parents' deepest vulnerabilities. The very next morning, my personal phone lit up with a barrage of urgent text messages, followed immediately by an aggressive phone call from my father. I let it ring twice before finally answering, putting Howard on speakerphone as I calmly poured my morning coffee. His voice was a booming, chaotic mix of righteous indignation and desperate panic. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not inquire about my pregnancy. Instead, he launched into a vicious, breathless tirade about how my cruel, jealous behavior the previous day had sent Brittany into a severe medical spiral. According to Howard, my sister was currently hyperventilating in the waiting room of the most exclusive fertility clinic in the city. He claimed her doctors had urgently warned them that the extreme emotional stress I had intentionally caused was actively destroying her final chance at conceiving a child. Then came his ultimate demand. Howard informed me that Brittany required an immediate, highly experimental IVF procedure. He dramatically referred to it as a last-chance protocol, a medical miracle that cost a staggering $100,000 upfront in cash. He stated that since his own liquid assets were currently tied up in supporting Spencer's massively successful business, it was my absolute duty to provide the funds. Howard ordered me to immediately liquidate my modest corporate 401k, the retirement account he assumed I had been slowly building as a low-level clerical worker. He framed this financial extortion as my mandatory penance. He told me that draining my life savings to pay for Brittany's procedure was the only way I could ever earn forgiveness for the trauma I had inflicted upon the family. I listened to his frantic, commanding tone and felt a profound sense of disgust wash over me. It was a brilliantly twisted, thoroughly evil scheme. Spencer desperately needed a massive injection of untraceable cash to temporarily plug the gaping holes in his corporate ledgers before my auditors ripped his company apart. Brittany was using her fake infertility to extort that exact amount from the family, utilizing my father as her personal attack dog to secure the funds. I told Howard I would meet them at the clinic. I did not say I was bringing a check, but his arrogant mind eagerly filled in the blanks. He hung up the phone thoroughly convinced he had successfully bullied his failure of a daughter into total submission. I walked into my home office and printed out two very specific documents. The first was a freshly drafted legal subpoena from Apex Capital, legally compelling Brittany and Spencer to surrender all personal banking records connected to the misappropriated corporate funds. The second was a document I had pulled directly from the fertility clinic's own public website. I placed both items into a sleek leather folder, grabbed my coat, and headed out the door. The Wellington Fertility Institute was located in a pristine, high-rent medical plaza on the wealthiest side of the city. The waiting room was designed to look like a luxury spa, featuring cascading water walls, plush velvet seating, and a heavy calming scent of lavender and eucalyptus. It was a place explicitly designed to soothe the nerves of anxious wealthy couples. It was absolutely not a place designed for a loud public reckoning. But that was exactly what I brought with me. I walked through the heavy frosted glass doors and spotted them immediately. Brittany was draped dramatically across a velvet sofa, clutching a tissue and breathing in shallow, jagged theatrical gasps. Barbara hovered over her like a fiercely protective guard dog, rubbing her shoulder and glaring aggressively at the reception staff. My mother was loudly demanding that the lead physician come out immediately to reassure her traumatized daughter and expedite the payment process. When Barbara saw me walking across the plush carpet, her eyes narrowed with pure venom. She stood up, instantly blocking my path to Brittany. She held out her hand, palm up, in a silent, demanding gesture. She wanted the check. She wanted the life savings I was supposedly handing over as my ultimate penance. I completely ignored her outstretched hand. I looked past her to Brittany, who was peering at me over her crumpled tissue, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. I asked Brittany if Spencer was aware that she was trying to extort $100,000 from my retirement fund to cover his massive offshore gambling debts. Barbara gasped loudly, her hand dropping to her side. She furiously ordered me to stop speaking such vile, jealous nonsense in a public medical facility. She insisted that Brittany was suffering from severe reproductive trauma and that I was a cruel, heartless monster for bringing up Spencer's highly successful business at a delicate time like this. She demanded I hand over the money immediately so they could begin the experimental procedure and save her future grandchild. I did not lower my voice. The few other wealthy couples in the waiting room had already stopped reading their magazines and were staring directly at us in stunned silence. The receptionists behind the curved marble desk had frozen completely in place, watching the drama unfold. I calmly opened my leather folder and pulled out the crisp, brightly colored pricing guide I had printed from the clinic's own website. I held the document up high so Barbara could clearly see the numbers. I read the figures aloud, my voice echoing off the cascading water wall with lethal clarity. I pointed out that the absolute most expensive, comprehensive top-tier IVF cycle this specific clinic offered, including all advanced genetic testing, specialty medications, and exclusive incubation protocols, cost exactly $15,000. There was no secret experimental $100,000 procedure. It simply did not exist. I stepped closer to my mother, forcing her to look at the printed numbers on the page. I asked her to explain the math. I asked her why her daughter needed $100,000 for a $15,000 medical procedure. I turned my attention to the reception desk and asked the shocked staff if they had recently instituted an $85,000 unlisted surcharge for dramatic lobby performances. The lead receptionist stammered nervously, shaking her head rapidly, confirming loudly for the entire room that $15,000 was their absolute maximum package rate. I turned back to Barbara, my voice turning to pure ice. I told her the $85,000 difference was not for medical miracles or last-chance protocols. It was a desperate slush fund. I explained that Spencer's company was currently facing total unmitigated collapse. I stated clearly and unequivocally that Spencer had taken $400,000 of Howard's retirement savings and lost every single penny of it in an illegal cryptocurrency casino. I told her that Brittany was faking this entire medical emergency to steal my life savings to temporarily save her husband from impending federal fraud charges. Brittany let out a high-pitched theatrical wail, burying her face in her hands and sobbing that I was making it all up to ruin her life. She cried to Barbara that I was a pathological liar trying to destroy their sacred family bond out of pure spite. Barbara's face contorted with absolute unhinged fury. Her entire worldview, her perfect family image was being aggressively threatened. Rather than face the horrifying truth about her golden child, she actively chose to attack the messenger. She stepped right into my personal space, her face flushed dark red with rage. She screamed that I was a jealous, vindictive liar. She yelled that Spencer was a brilliant entrepreneur and that Brittany was a saint for putting up with my constant toxic jealousy. She told me I was entirely delusional and that my father was going to legally disown me for this unforgivable stunt. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I calmly reached into my leather folder a second time and pulled out the thick, legally binding subpoena. It was stamped with the official, undeniable seal of the state court listing Spencer and Brittany as the primary targets of a massive financial fraud investigation. I held the heavy document out toward Barbara. I told her that she did not have to believe a single word I said. I told her she could take this subpoena, hand it directly to her precious son-in-law, and ask him why the regional bank was officially seizing all of his corporate assets. I told her to ask Spencer why the anonymous private equity firm that recently bought his debt was currently preparing to foreclose on the family estate Howard had foolishly used as collateral. Barbara stared at the legal document in my hand. Her eyes darted frantically from the embossed court seal to my calm, unwavering face. The absolute certainty in my voice terrified her. The undeniable physical proof of a major legal action shattered her aggressive bravado, but her stubborn pride was a vicious, blinding force. Instead of taking the document to read the truth for herself, Barbara let out a sharp cry of rage and violently slapped my hand. The force of her strike sent the heavy subpoena flying through the air. The thick stack of legal papers hit the pristine marble floor, sliding across the room and coming to a rest directly at the feet of a stunned receptionist. Barbara pointed a violently shaking finger at my face, her chest heaving with exertion. She promised me, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated hatred, that I was going to regret this day for the rest of my miserable life. She swore that Howard would completely destroy me for trying to frame Spencer and for causing a public scene that humiliated the family name. She turned swiftly, grabbed the sobbing Brittany by the arm, and practically dragged her out of the clinic, leaving the subpoena lying on the cold marble floor. I stood in the center of the lavish waiting room, completely unbothered by their dramatic exit. I calmly walked over, picked up the legal document, brushed off a tiny speck of dust, and handed it to the bewildered receptionist. I politely instructed her to mail it to the home address listed on the front page, noting that the recipients had accidentally left their legal mail behind. I walked out of the clinic into the bright afternoon sun, feeling the warmth on my face. The absolute destruction of their fake empire was no longer a looming threat. It was an absolute guarantee. The glow of that afternoon carried me through the rest of the week. I had successfully severed the main artery of their financial deception, leaving Spencer and my mother to suffocate in the toxic fumes of their own lies. My focus shifted entirely away from their pathetic circus and toward the only thing that truly mattered in my life: our baby. Today was our 20-week anatomy scan, a major, highly anticipated medical milestone where we would finally see the intricate details of our child's developing heart, spine, and face. Connor had taken the entire day off from his architectural firm. He was buzzing with a nervous, vibrant energy, double-checking the diaper bag we had prematurely packed and ensuring the car seat base was perfectly secured in his vehicle. His pure, unfiltered joy was a stark, beautiful contrast to the absolute venom I had navigated at the fertility clinic just days prior. We drove to the premier maternal fetal medicine center downtown, holding hands tightly across the center console. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of protective love. I was utilizing my vast wealth to build an impenetrable fortress of security for this child, ensuring they would never know the conditional, weaponized affection that had entirely defined my own upbringing. We walked through the sliding glass doors of the specialist clinic, the air smelling faintly of vanilla and medical-grade sanitizer, completely unprepared for the absolute devastation waiting for us at the front desk. I approached the reception area, greeting a warm, professional woman named Sarah, who had checked us in for every previous appointment. I offered a bright smile and clearly stated my name. Sarah typed the information into her secure terminal, her brow furrowing in immediate visible confusion. She tapped the keyboard a few more times, her expression shifting rapidly from mild perplexity to deep, uncomfortable distress. She looked up at Connor and me, her voice dropping to a cautious, hesitant whisper. She informed us that my appointment was not currently on the schedule. I politely suggested there must be a simple glitch in the system, assuring her we had booked this specific scan over a month ago. Sarah shook her head slowly, her eyes filling with a mixture of profound pity and genuine alarm. She turned the monitor slightly, reading the private medical notes attached to my secure file. She stated that my profile indicated I had called the office 2 days prior to aggressively cancel all future prenatal appointments. I stared at her, the blood roaring violently in my ears. I told her with absolute certainty that I had made no such phone call. Sarah swallowed hard, her professional medical demeanor cracking under the weight of the information she was reading. She read the final devastating note aloud, her voice trembling in the quiet waiting room. The official clinical log stated that I had canceled the crucial anatomy scan because I had decided to medically terminate the pregnancy. The polished floor seemed to drop out from beneath my feet. The sterile, brightly lit walls of the waiting room rapidly closed in the ambient noise of the clinic, fading into a sharp, high-pitched, ringing silence. My breath caught painfully in my throat, trapped by a sudden, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. It was a violation so profound, so deeply twisted and evil, that my analytical mind momentarily refused to process the sheer reality of the words. My mother had actually weaponized the existence of my unborn child. Barbara had taken the basic biographical data she knew about me, my date of birth, my previous residential address, my maiden name, and used it to maliciously impersonate me over the phone. She had successfully bypassed the basic security protocols of the medical facility to violently rip away one of the most joyous moments of my pregnancy. She wanted to punish me for exposing Brittany's fake infertility at the clinic. She wanted to hurt me in the most intimate, devastating way she could possibly imagine. For the first time since this entire chaotic ordeal began, my stoic, carefully constructed corporate armor completely shattered. A choked, jagged sob escaped my lips, echoing loudly in the quiet reception area. I covered my mouth with both hands, my vision swimming with hot, angry tears of pure violation. Connor reacted instantly. His protective instincts flared into a terrifying cold fury. He stepped directly between me and the reception desk, his broad shoulders physically shielding me from the curious stares of the other expectant parents. He wrapped his strong arms around my shaking frame, pulling me tightly against his chest. He did not care who was watching us break down. He held me securely, whispering fierce, grounding promises into my hair, assuring me that our baby was completely safe, that we were safe, and that my mother would pay an astronomical price for this psychological assault. We retreated to a private consultation room that Sarah quickly and discreetly arranged for us. I sat on the edge of the examination table, my head buried in my hands, allowing the tears of betrayal to fall freely. I mourned the mother I never truly had. I mourned the absolute lack of maternal boundary that allowed a woman to casually erase her own grandchild from a medical registry simply to score a point in a petty family feud. But my profound grief was incredibly brief. The overwhelming sadness that had temporarily paralyzed me began to crystallize into something entirely different. The hot tears dried rapidly on my cheeks, replaced by a deep, glacial resolve. My sorrow hardened instantly into an unbreakable, cold-blooded determination. Barbara had crossed the final unforgivable line. She had moved away from simple financial manipulation and stepped directly into active malicious interference in my private health care. She had committed a severe federal crime. I looked up at Connor, wiping my face with a tissue. My voice was no longer shaking. I was completely composed, my mind shifting effortlessly back into the tactical, predatory mindset that made me a titan in the private equity sector. I told him we were not leaving this hospital building until I possessed the audio recording of that phone call. I marched out of the consultation room and aggressively demanded an immediate meeting with the hospital's chief security compliance officer. As a woman who dealt with high-level corporate espionage, hostile takeovers, and strict legal covenants daily, I knew exactly how to navigate massive institutional liability. The compliance officer, a stern, sharply dressed man named David, initially tried to offer standard bureaucratic excuses, citing protocol and patient privacy regulations to deny my request. I shut his rehearsed speech down immediately. I informed him that his front desk staff had negligently allowed an unauthorized third party to access my secure medical records, cancel critical prenatal care, and fraudulently alter my medical history without executing proper identity verification. I laid out the exact federal HIPAA violations his department had just committed and promised him that my corporate legal team from Apex Capital would descend upon their hospital network and bankrupt them in federal court if he did not cooperate with me instantly. Faced with the very real, terrifying threat of a massive federal lawsuit, David quickly abandoned his protocol speech and complied. He accessed the centralized hospital telecommunications server and pulled the specific audio file of the phone call made to the clinic 2 days prior. We sat in his sterile, windowless office and listened to the recording. The unmistakable sound of Barbara's voice filled the small room. She sounded remarkably calm, employing a fake, breathless, distressed tone as she effortlessly provided my date of birth and social security number. She smoothly and convincingly told the receptionist that she was going through a devastating personal crisis and needed to clear her entire medical schedule immediately to arrange for a termination. Hearing my own mother successfully and maliciously impersonate me to commit such an atrocious act of emotional sabotage removed any lingering shred of familial obligation I held in my heart. I instructed David to secure a certified time-stamped copy of the audio file and transfer it directly to my encrypted device. He handed me the digital file, apologizing profusely for the severe institutional oversight. We were miraculously able to salvage the afternoon. The clinic staff, absolutely horrified by the deception, managed to squeeze us in for our anatomy scan with the lead physician. We saw our perfectly healthy, thriving baby on the high-resolution monitor, but the joyous, beautiful moment was deeply underscored by the absolute certainty of the war I was about to escalate. The moment we stepped back into the private parking garage, the concrete walls echoing with our footsteps, I pulled out my secure corporate phone. I did not text Barbara. She was a petty, vindictive woman, lashing out because her golden child was finally being exposed to the harsh light of reality. Instead, I aimed my weapon directly at the man who funded and enabled the entire toxic ecosystem. I attached the certified audio file of Barbara explicitly committing wire fraud and medical impersonation and sent it directly to Howard. I followed the audio file with a meticulously crafted, terrifyingly precise text message. I asked my father exactly how far he was willing to let his unhinged wife go before he ended up in handcuffs right alongside her as an accessory to a federal crime. I informed him that I was currently holding physical, irrefutable proof of a felony, and I was fully prepared to hand it over to the authorities by the end of the day. I told him that his desperate, pathetic attempts to protect Spencer's crumbling tech empire were now bleeding heavily into severe criminal liability. I sat in the passenger seat of Connor's car and watched the read receipts indicate that Howard had opened the message and played the audio file. I waited for the inevitable explosion. I expected him to call me immediately to scream his lungs out to deny the recording, or perhaps in a rare, unprecedented moment of clarity, to express genuine horror at what his wife had actually done to his pregnant daughter. But my phone remained completely silent. Howard did not call. He did not text back. He completely ignored the undeniable recorded evidence of his wife's criminal behavior. The silence emanating from his end was louder and more revealing than any screaming match we had ever had. It confirmed exactly what my forensic auditors had already proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. Howard was entirely hopelessly consumed by pure panic over Spencer's massive financial collapse. He was hyper-focused on the multi-million-dollar bailout he mistakenly thought he was negotiating with the anonymous board of Apex Capital. He was frantically trying to secure the corporate funds to save his own mansion from immediate foreclosure and protect his hollow legacy from total annihilation. He simply did not care that his wife had committed a felony against his child. He only cared about saving his money. The financial trap I had built was perfectly primed, and my family was far too busy destroying each other to see the massive steel jaws closing rapidly around their throats. The morning of the emergency bailout meeting arrived with a heavy gray Seattle overcast that felt entirely appropriate for the corporate slaughter I was about to execute. I stood alone in my expansive corner office on the 50th floor of the Apex Capital Partners headquarters. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding, unobstructed view of the downtown skyline and the dark waters of the Puget Sound. It was a view reserved exclusively for the apex predators of the financial sector. I turned away from the sprawling cityscape and focused my absolute attention on the bank of high-definition security monitors glowing brightly on my mahogany desk. The trap I had spent weeks meticulously constructing was finally snapping shut. Down in the cavernous steel and marble lobby of the building, the private elevator doors slid open. I watched the live video feed with cold, clinical detachment as Spencer Howard and Barbara stepped out onto the polished floor. Brittany was conspicuously absent. I highly suspected she was currently locked inside her mortgaged mansion, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what she had seen on that printed banking log in my apartment lobby, entirely unable to face the reality of her husband's offshore gambling addiction. But Spencer had no choice. He was a desperate, cornered animal bleeding capital at a catastrophic rate, and he needed this meeting to survive the week. They had clearly dressed to impress a phantom billionaire. Spencer was wearing a sharply tailored, aggressive pinstripe suit that looked brand new, though I could clearly see the sheen of nervous sweat coating his forehead, even on the security camera. Howard was puffing out his chest, strutting through the lobby in his best country club blazer, projecting the false inflated authority of a wealthy patriarch. Barbara was flanked closely by his side, draped heavily in obnoxious, instantly recognizable designer labels, bought with the very stolen money that was about to send her son-in-law to federal prison. They looked exactly like what they were. They were small-time con artists, walking blindly into a fortress of institutional power, entirely convinced they could charm their way out of total financial ruin. My executive assistant, Elena, greeted them at the front desk. Elena was a fiercely intelligent, highly trained professional who knew exactly what was about to transpire. I had briefed her on the specific psychological profile of our guests. I watched as she offered them a polite, chillingly perfect corporate smile. She checked their names off the guest registry with smooth efficiency, maintaining the absolute illusion that they were respected, highly anticipated clients arriving for a standard executive consultation. They did not know the name of the managing partner. They simply assumed they were meeting a faceless, elderly titan of industry who could be easily swayed by Spencer's fabricated charisma and Howard's aggressive posturing. Elena expertly guided them away from the public reception area and escorted them down the long, imposing main corridor. The architectural design of the Apex Capital headquarters was intentionally psychological. The soaring glass walls, the brushed steel accents, the heavy acoustic dampening panels, and the sheer breathtaking scale of the wealth on display were explicitly engineered to make incoming targets feel incredibly small and entirely out of their depth. I watched their eyes dart nervously across the abstract artwork and the rows of silent, focused analysts working in the open bullpen. Spencer tugged uncomfortably at his expensive silk tie. Howard's forced swagger became slightly more rigid, his steps a fraction more hesitant, as the overwhelming reality of apex-level corporate power began to physically press down on his shoulders. Elena opened the heavy frosted glass doors to the main executive boardroom. It was our primary theater of operations, a room designed for hostile takeovers and brutal corporate acquisitions. A massive polished mahogany table dominated the center of the space, surrounded by ergonomic leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The far wall was a solid pane of glass overlooking the city, while the opposite wall featured a seamless, integrated presentation screen. Elena ushered them inside, gesturing gracefully to the seats directly facing the door. I sat down at my desk and tapped a specific command on my keyboard. The high-fidelity audio feed from the hidden boardroom microphones instantly piped directly into my office speakers. I leaned back in my leather chair, steepling my fingers, and listened to the rats scurrying inside the cage. The heavy glass door clicked shut, leaving the three of them alone in the quiet, temperature-controlled room. For a brief second, there was total silence. Then Howard let out a low, impressed whistle. He slapped his hand loudly against the polished mahogany table, the sound echoing sharply through my speakers. He told Spencer that this was exactly what real power looked like. His voice was a booming, arrogant rumble of misplaced confidence. He aggressively clapped his son-in-law on the shoulder, ordering him to stop sweating and stand tall. Howard boasted loudly that they were going to walk out of this room with a $3 million bridge loan. He spoke about the massive sum of money with a casual, sickening flippancy, entirely ignoring the fact that Spencer had already secretly squandered Howard's entire $400,000 retirement fund on illegal cryptocurrency roulette. Howard was completely blinded by his desperate need to be associated with tech wealth. He enthusiastically reassured Spencer that using the family estate as collateral for the Apex loan was a brilliant temporary strategic maneuver. He truly believed he was securing a temporary cash flow issue, entirely unaware that he was officially signing away the deed to his home to a company that his own daughter controlled. Barbara chimed in, her voice dripping with an ugly, self-satisfied elitism. She aggressively dismissed the intimidating surroundings, adjusting her designer handbag on the table and smoothing her expensive skirt. She loudly proclaimed that this exact level of immense, undeniable success was exactly what her perfect Brittany deserved. She stated that Spencer was a brilliant visionary who merely needed a minor financial push to conquer the industry. Then, exactly as I anticipated, their conversation violently pivoted to me. Howard needed to actively tear down my life to validate the horrific, risky choices he was currently making. He scoffed loudly, his voice echoing in the boardroom. He told Spencer not to worry about the pathetic, jealous scene I had caused at the clinic. He declared that I was a bitter, deeply mediocre clerk, living a completely insignificant life in a cheap apartment. He laughed, a cruel, harsh sound, stating that my entire existence was a total failure compared to the massive corporate empire Spencer was building. He claimed I was simply trying to drag the family down into my own miserable, impoverished reality, because I could not stand to see them sitting in boardrooms like this. Barbara's response was even more venomous. I listened carefully, my face a mask of absolute glacial calm as my mother actively delighted in her recent felony. She did not express a single shred of remorse for maliciously impersonating me and attempting to cancel the 20-week anatomy scan of her own unborn grandchild. Instead, she laughed. She told Howard that she had successfully handled my toxic jealousy. She boasted that putting me in my place was necessary to protect their peace of mind while they secured their rightful financial empire. She sat in my boardroom, drinking my imported sparkling water, actively praising herself for committing a severe federal medical crime against my family. Her sheer, unadulterated toxicity was staggering, but it only fueled the cold, methodical engine of my resolve. On the video feed, I watched Spencer nervously open his monogrammed leather briefcase. His hands were shaking visibly. He pulled out thick stacks of heavily manipulated financial documents and began spreading them across the mahogany table. I knew exactly what those papers contained because my forensic accounting team had already hacked, dismantled, and thoroughly audited the real versions. Spencer was currently laying out completely forged profit and loss statements. He was arranging fabricated vendor contracts with ghost companies that did not exist. He was setting up heavily doctored revenue projections explicitly designed to hide the fact that he was bleeding millions of dollars into offshore gambling syndicates. He was meticulously preparing to pitch a massive coordinated federal fraud to a private equity firm. He actually believed he was smart enough to con a room full of apex predators. The tension in the boardroom was palpable, thick, and suffocating. Spencer adjusted his tie for the fourth time. Howard paced back and forth across the plush carpet, rehearsing his aggressive opening remarks under his breath. Barbara sat perfectly still, practicing her most regal, entitled posture. They were completely ready. They were primed to execute their desperate illusion. I pressed the intercom button on my desk and gave Elena the final signal. On the monitor, I watched the boardroom door swing open smoothly. Elena stepped inside carrying a silver tray with fresh carafes of sparkling water and crystal glasses. She smiled warmly at the three of them, perfectly masking her knowledge of their impending doom. She set the water down, collected their empty glasses, and looked directly at Howard. Her voice was bright, professional, and chillingly precise. She informed them that the managing partner was just finishing a final review of their collateral documents, including the deed to the family estate, and would be stepping into the room momentarily. Howard beamed with arrogant pride, aggressively buttoning his blazer and standing at attention. Spencer wiped a fresh bead of sweat from his upper lip, his eyes locked desperately on the door. Barbara offered a stiff, condescending nod of approval. Elena gracefully exited the room, the heavy glass door clicking shut behind her. I stood up from my desk. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal gray suit. I reached down and picked up the thick black leather folder resting on my blotter. It did not contain fabricated projections or fake vendor contracts. It contained the absolute undeniable instruments of their total destruction. It held the forensic audit proving Spencer's massive offshore gambling fraud. It held the finalized legally binding foreclosure notices for the family estate Howard was so eager to surrender. And most importantly, it held the digital audio player loaded with the certified hospital security recording of Barbara committing felony wire fraud. I walked out of my corner office and stepped into the long glass corridor. The click of my heels against the hardwood floor was sharp, rhythmic, and entirely unhurried. I was not a bitter clerk. I was not a jealous sister. I was the architect of their absolute ruin, and the waiting game was finally over. I reached the frosted glass doors of the main executive boardroom, placed my hand firmly on the brushed steel handle, and pushed the door wide open. The heavy frosted glass doors gave way effortlessly under my hand. I stepped over the threshold, Connor entering a half step behind me. The ambient hum of the building seemed to instantly vanish, replaced entirely by the sharp, rhythmic, authoritative click of my heels against the dark hardwood floor. I was wearing a charcoal gray custom-tailored maternity suit that draped perfectly over my growing frame, projecting an image of absolute untouchable authority. I carried nothing but a sleek black tablet and the heavy leather folder containing their impending total destruction. Howard had been leaning far back in his ergonomic leather chair, mid-laugh, completely basking in the warm, arrogant glow of his anticipated victory. He was visualizing the millions of dollars he believed were about to be wired into his accounts. The exact moment he registered my face, his entire expression violently contorted. The smug satisfaction melted away instantly, replaced by a flash of confusion followed immediately by pure, unadulterated rage. He slammed his palms flat against the polished mahogany table and shot up from his seat, his chair screeching harshly against the plush carpet. His face flushed a dark, angry purple, the veins in his neck bulging against his stiff, heavily starched collar. He demanded to know what I was doing inside this secure corporate building. He screamed that my obsessive, jealous stalking had finally gone too far, violently accusing me of tracking his private movements to sabotage the most important financial deal of Spencer's entire life. He pointed a trembling, aggressive finger at my face, his voice booming across the acoustic dampening panels of the executive boardroom. He declared that I was deeply sick, a pathetic, mediocre clerk who was so consumed by bitter envy that I had resorted to sneaking into a high-rise financial firm just to harass my betters. He threatened to call the receptionist and have Apex Capital's private security team drag me out of the building in handcuffs. He loudly boasted that his new billionaire partner would ensure I was prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law for corporate espionage. Barbara was right beside him, instantly jumping into the fray, her voice a shrill, piercing siren of indignation. She clutched her designer pearls, gasping theatrically as she looked me up and down with profound disgust. She told me I was a deeply disturbed psychotic woman who needed to be permanently institutionalized. She reached for her cell phone, aggressively waving it in my direction, threatening to dial the police herself. She yelled that I was embarrassing myself, humiliating the sacred family name, and destroying their peace of mind during a critical business negotiation. She commanded me to turn around, walk out the door, and return to the pathetic, insignificant life I had created for myself before the real executives arrived and witnessed my lower-class display. I did not break my stride. I did not flinch. I did not offer a single word of defense or justification against their chaotic, desperate ranting. I walked deliberately past the row of guest chairs, completely ignoring Howard's spittle-laced threats and Barbara's screeching insults. I moved directly to the oversized leather chair positioned at the absolute head of the long mahogany table, the seat of ultimate power, the seat reserved exclusively for the managing partner. I sat down smoothly, placing my black tablet flat on the reflective surface of the table. Connor took up a stoic, imposing position standing directly behind my right shoulder. He crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw set, his gaze fixed on Spencer with a terrifying protective intensity. We did not say a word. We simply watched them. Howard was practically hyperventilating with rage. He slammed his fist against the table again, ordering me to get up immediately. He screamed that I was sitting in the boss's chair, insisting that my childish, arrogant stunt was going to cost Spencer a $3 million bailout. He demanded that I apologize to him and to Spencer right this second, and then physically crawl out of the boardroom before I ruined their entire future. I maintained my absolute glacial composure. I did not raise my voice. I simply opened my leather folder. I reached inside the secure pocket and withdrew a single heavy platinum business card. The metal was cool and solid against my fingertips. With a swift, practiced, effortless motion, I flicked my wrist. The heavy platinum card slid smoothly across the vast expanse of the polished mahogany table. It glided with a quiet, incredibly expensive metallic sound, coming to a perfect, precise halt directly in front of Spencer's folded hands. Spencer glared at me, his jaw clenched with supreme, arrogant annoyance. He let out a harsh, dismissive breath, looking down at the card, fully intending to brush it away off the edge of the table. But as his eyes focused on the deeply embossed black lettering, the world simply stopped turning. The physical transformation was horrifying, instantaneous, and profoundly beautiful to witness. The arrogant, slick, confident tech visionary facade dissolved in a fraction of a second. Every single drop of blood rushed violently from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent corpse-like gray. His hands began to tremble so violently that he had to physically pull them off the table and press them hard against his thighs to stop the shaking. He slumped heavily back into his chair, the air rushing out of his lungs in a ragged, audible gasp. His eyes went wide, filled with a sudden, absolute crushing terror. It was as if someone had abruptly pulled the plug on his central nervous system. Howard stopped his screaming mid-sentence, his thick brow furrowed as he witnessed his golden son-in-law practically disintegrate right in front of him. He looked from Spencer to me, utterly bewildered by the sudden, terrifying shift in the atmosphere. He demanded to know what was printed on the card. He barked at Spencer to speak, ordering him to ignore my pathetic, childish parlor tricks and focus on the impending meeting. Spencer simply shook his head slowly side to side, completely unable to produce a single sound, entirely paralyzed by the realization of his fatal, irreversible error. I leaned forward, resting my forearms gracefully on the table. My voice was low, cold, and sliced through the heavy, suffocating silence of the boardroom with surgical, lethal precision. I addressed Spencer directly. I informed him that I had personally reviewed the fabricated, highly manipulated pitch deck he had boldly submitted to my acquisitions team. I told him that his desperate claims of utilizing advanced machine learning algorithms, specifically support vector machines, and complex k-means clustering to optimize his logistics supply chains were entirely fraudulent. I noted that his supposed enterprise-grade IT infrastructure, which he loudly boasted was built on a massive VMware vSphere environment with intricate vCenter server integrations, simply did not exist anywhere outside of his own imagination. I watched his breathing turn shallow and erratic as I systematically dismantled his entire stolen life. I explained that my forensic auditors had completed a devastatingly thorough financial statement analysis of his corporate ledgers. We had applied the fundamental 4 Ps of marketing to evaluate his actual product pricing placement and promotional strategies. We discovered absolutely zero functional back-end architecture. His highly touted mobile application, which he claimed featured sculptural elegance and advanced directional lighting in its user interface design, was nothing more than a hollow, non-functional shell. It was a fake wireframe hastily coded with basic Kotlin and Jetpack Compose, completely devoid of any real logistics routing capability. It was a digital ghost town. I did not stop there. I kept my eyes locked onto his terrified face as I informed him that I knew exactly where his capital was going. I told him I had the routing numbers, the offshore bank accounts, and the exact timestamps of his illegal cryptocurrency gambling transfers. I told him his tech logistics startup was an empty storefront carefully engineered to hide a massive bleeding void of addiction and federal fraud. Howard could no longer handle the agonizing suspense. He aggressively reached across the table and snatched the heavy platinum card from right in front of Spencer. He pulled it close to his face, his eyes squinting as he read the embossed text. I watched the exact moment his reality shattered into a million jagged pieces. He read my full name. He read my official title: Managing Partner, Chief Executive Officer, Apex Capital Partners. The realization hit Howard like a speeding freight train. The phantom billionaire he had been dressing up to impress the anonymous, incredibly powerful financial savior, who held the absolute keys to his entire family's survival, was the exact same daughter he had spent 30 years violently, relentlessly trying to erase. I was the boss. I owned the building. I controlled the wealth he desperately craved, and he had just handed me the legal deed to his family estate as collateral for a loan he was never ever going to receive. Howard dropped the platinum card onto the mahogany table as if the metal were burning his fingers. The heavy card landed with a sharp clink that echoed loudly in the silent room. His mouth opened in a silent, suffocating scream of absolute, unmitigated horror. Barbara let out a tiny, high-pitched squeak, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as her eyes darted frantically around the opulent boardroom, finally understanding the true terrifying scale of the empire her forgotten daughter had built. Howard stared at the platinum card resting on the mahogany table as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The absolute silence in the executive boardroom was deafening, broken only by the ragged, panicked breathing of Spencer, who remained slumped in his chair, completely paralyzed by the reality of his doom. Howard's face flushed a deep mottled purple, his mind utterly incapable of processing the monumental shift in power, violently rejected the facts presented directly in front of him. He shook his head rapidly, a nervous, erratic twitch taking over his posture. He slammed his fist onto the table, the sharp crack echoing off the glass walls. He shouted that this was a grotesque, illegal forgery. He screamed that I had obviously paid a printer to create fake business cards in a desperate, pathetic attempt to sabotage a multi-million-dollar corporate meeting. He pointed a shaking finger at Connor, demanding to know how we had bypassed building security to stage this malicious prank. Howard turned desperately to his son-in-law, ordering Spencer to call the real executives, completely blind to the fact that Spencer was currently staring into the abyss of federal prison. I did not offer a single word in my defense. I did not engage with his frantic, delusional ranting. I simply picked up my black tablet from the polished table and tapped a single command on the glass screen. The heavy acoustic dampening blinds on the exterior windows automatically lowered, plunging the room into a cool, cinematic twilight. A low, powerful hum vibrated through the floorboards as the massive, seamless presentation screen covering the entire eastern wall flared to life in ultra-high definition. The brilliant white light illuminated the terrified faces of my guests. I bypassed the standard corporate pleasantries and immediately projected the unredacted comprehensive findings of my forensic audit directly onto the wall for everyone to see. I looked at Howard, my voice entirely devoid of emotion, echoing with chilling clarity through the integrated boardroom speakers. I told him we were going to officially review the financial viability of the company he was currently offering his family home to protect. The screen shifted, displaying Spencer's primary corporate ledgers side by side with the actual verified banking data my team had successfully extracted. I methodically walked them through the absolute devastation of the tech logistics empire. I highlighted the massive, glaring discrepancies in his revenue reports. I used a digital laser pointer on my tablet to circle the names of his primary vendors, clearly explaining that every single one of them was a fabricated shell company registered to empty post office boxes in Delaware. I showed them the bloated executive payroll accounts, proving with undeniable bank routing numbers that the hundreds of thousands of dollars supposedly paying phantom employees were actually being funneled directly into Spencer's personal offshore holding accounts. I completely dismantled the illusion of his brilliant startup, exposing it as nothing more than a crude, desperate Ponzi scheme designed to fund an extravagant lifestyle while producing absolutely zero functional technology. Spencer buried his face in his hands, letting out a low, pathetic moan. He did not attempt to deny the data. The sheer volume of hard, undeniable evidence projected on the wall crushed any remaining instinct he had to lie. Howard, however, remained stubbornly anchored to his delusions. He aggressively loosened his silk tie, his breathing shallow and rapid. He shouted at the screen, desperately claiming that these were just standard aggressive startup expenditures. He insisted that Spencer was a visionary disruptor who simply needed a temporary bridge loan to finalize his revolutionary algorithms. He blindly defended the man who had actively ruined him completely, unable to admit that his flawless judgment was entirely wrong. I tapped the tablet again. The screen instantly flashed to a new slide displaying a highly detailed chronological flowchart of massive outgoing wire transfers. I informed Howard that his visionary son-in-law was not investing in algorithms or logistics architecture. I told him his golden boy was a severe, completely out-of-control gambling addict. I expanded the graph, bringing the offshore cryptocurrency casino ledgers front and center. The sheer frequency and volume of the bets painted a horrifying picture of a man frantically chasing losses with stolen money. Then I pulled up the single devastating transaction that I knew would finally break my father's mind. The screen displayed a massive incoming wire transfer of exactly $400,000 originating from a local regional bank. The origin account details were clearly visible. I looked directly into Howard's eyes and watched the color completely drain from his face as he recognized his own personal retirement account number glowing brightly on the wall. I did not soften the blow. I traced the path of that specific money on the screen. I showed him how the $400,000 entered Spencer's corporate account sat there for exactly 18 minutes and was then immediately wired directly to a high-stakes roulette syndicate operating out of the Cayman Islands. I stated clearly, my voice echoing off the glass walls, that his life savings were completely gone. I told him the money he had spent 40 years accumulating was not securing a pre-IPO investment or building a legacy for his grandchildren. It had been vaporized on a digital roulette table in a matter of seconds. I informed Howard that he was entirely destitute and he had personally handed his entire future to a pathological con artist. Howard collapsed backward into his ergonomic leather chair. His mouth opened and closed silently, his eyes fixed on the time-stamped banking logs proving his absolute ruin. His aggressive, boasting posture completely deflated, leaving him looking like a small, terrified, broken old man. I expected the room to fall into a heavy, mournful silence. I expected my mother to finally turn her wrath upon the man who had just destroyed her financial security and jeopardized her luxurious lifestyle. I severely underestimated the sheer depth of Barbara's toxic, unwavering favoritism. Barbara stared at the screen, completely processing the undeniable fact that Spencer had stolen their retirement and gambled it away. Then she looked at the platinum business card resting on the table. She looked at my custom-tailored suit, the massive, opulent boardroom, and the undeniable reality that I commanded an empire worth billions. In a breathtaking display of narcissistic gymnastics, Barbara's mind completely bypassed Spencer's criminality and focused entirely on my wealth. She saw an immediate, effortless solution to her impending poverty, and she fully expected me to provide it. Barbara slammed her hands on the mahogany table and stood up, her face twisted in a mask of furious, unbelievable entitlement. She did not yell at Spencer. She turned her absolute venom directly onto me. She aggressively justified Spencer's massive theft, brushing it off as a simple, understandable mistake caused by the immense pressure of running a tech company. She screamed that since I was clearly sitting on millions of dollars of hoarded secret wealth, it was my absolute moral duty to fix this minor family issue immediately. She pointed an accusing finger at my face, her voice a shrill, piercing shriek. "You are a monster to let your sister go bankrupt when you have this kind of money," she screeched, her chest heaving with righteous indignation. She demanded that I instantly write off Spencer's corporate debts, replenish Howard's retirement account in full, and approve the $3 million bridge loan so Brittany could maintain the lifestyle she was accustomed to. She framed my immense success not as an achievement to be respected, but as a convenient mandatory slush fund for her golden child. She ordered me to stop playing these cruel, jealous games and do my job as a loyal daughter. I let her toxic demands echo through the silent room. I let her reveal the absolute unvarnished ugliness of her character for the official corporate record. I remained perfectly still, feeling the reassuring presence of Connor standing solidly behind me. I leaned toward the center of the table, pressing a discreet silver button built directly into the mahogany surface. The button activated the official legally mandated audio and video recording systems used for all final financial determinations within Apex Capital. A small red light illuminated near the ceiling, signaling that every word spoken was now an immutable corporate record. I looked Barbara dead in the eye, my expression entirely devoid of mercy or hesitation. I spoke with absolute clinical authority, ensuring the microphones captured my exact phrasing. I formally and officially denied the $3 million bridge loan application submitted by Spencer's holding company. I stated on the record that the application was entirely predicated on massively falsified financial projections and the willful, malicious concealment of severe corporate debt. Furthermore, I officially rejected the use of the family estate as collateral, citing Howard's gross financial negligence and Spencer's active ongoing federal wire fraud. Barbara gasped, her mouth falling open in genuine shock, completely unable to comprehend that her demands were being ignored. Howard remained slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the floor. Spencer began to quietly hyperventilate, the reality of federal prison finally crushing the air from his lungs. I did not give them a moment to argue. I tapped a final command on my tablet. The secondary, discreet wooden doors on the far side of the boardroom swung open in perfect unison. My lead corporate counsel, a ruthless, brilliant attorney named Marcus, stepped into the room flanked by 3 senior members of my litigation team. They wore immaculate dark suits and carried thick, heavily documented legal binders. They moved with the silent, synchronized efficiency of a highly trained strike unit, taking up positions along the glass wall. I turned my attention away from my horrified family and addressed Marcus directly. I instructed my legal team on the official corporate record to immediately initiate the accelerated calling in of all Spencer's existing corporate debts owned by our subsidiaries. I ordered them to immediately file the necessary injunctions to freeze all of his remaining personal and business accounts due to the confirmed use of fraudulent collateral. I instructed Marcus to prepare the complete, unredacted forensic audit dossier and transfer it directly to the federal authorities for immediate criminal prosecution regarding the offshore wire fraud. The financial chokehold was now fully legally secured. There was no escape, no negotiation, and absolutely no mercy. I sat back in my chair, resting my hands calmly on the mahogany table, and watched the devastating, irreversible consequences of their actions completely consume the room. The heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom were thrown violently open, shattering the heavy, suffocating silence. The sudden noise caused Spencer to violently flinch, his head snapping up from his hands. Brittany stood framed in the doorway. She was trembling, her knuckles white as she clutched the steel handle. She had clearly been pacing the lobby, entirely unable to face the anonymous billionaire CEO, yet completely incapable of waiting blindly for the verdict of their financial survival. Her eyes darted wildly around the expansive room, instantly taking in the scene of absolute devastation. She saw Spencer completely broken, sweating profusely through his aggressive pinstripe suit. She saw Howard slumped deeply in his ergonomic chair, his chest heaving with panicked, shallow breaths. She saw Barbara pale and clutching the polished mahogany table for physical support. Finally, her gaze traveled to the head of the table. She locked eyes with me, taking in my tailored maternity suit, the imposing presence of Connor standing rigidly behind me, and the highly trained team of corporate lawyers flanking my position. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The anonymous apex predator holding the keys to their entire financial existence was the exact same sister they had spent a lifetime trying to violently erase. She looked past me to the massive high-definition digital display illuminating the eastern wall. She saw the unredacted forensic audit of Spencer's offshore gambling syndicates. She saw the meticulously tracked wire transfers, proving the complete vaporization of Howard's $400,000 retirement fund. Brittany saw the absolute ruin of her carefully curated luxurious life, mapped out in undeniable glowing financial graphs. Her perfect elite tech wife facade completely fractured. But Brittany was a survivalist within her own toxic ecosystem. She possessed a terrifying, almost sociopathic ability to pivot when cornered. I watched her calculate her next move in real time. She could not argue the empirical facts projected on the screen. She could not deny the offshore accounts or the fabricated vendor contracts. The money was undeniably gone, and Apex Capital was legally seizing everything they owned. She needed a psychological distraction profound enough to reset the entire board and hijack the narrative back from the absolute brink of total annihilation. She took 3 unsteady steps onto the plush carpet and collapsed dramatically. It was a calculated, highly theatrical drop to her knees. She threw her hands over her face and let out a piercing hysterical sob that echoed sharply off the acoustic dampening panels. Howard and Barbara snapped out of their paralyzed shock. Their ingrained parental programming instantly overrode the reality of their massive financial devastation. Brittany lowered her hands. Her face was perfectly composed into a mask of pure tragic joy, tears streaming flawlessly down her cheeks. "Mom, Dad," she wailed, her voice trembling with expertly manufactured emotion. "I did not want to tell you because of the stress of Spencer's business. I wanted to wait until he secured the bridge loan today. But the last round worked. It finally worked. I am pregnant. It is an absolute miracle." The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. I sat perfectly still at the head of the table, observing the performance with cold, clinical detachment. I knew for an absolute fact, confirmed by the catastrophic confrontation at the fertility clinic, that Brittany was not pregnant. I knew her entire multi-year infertility struggle was a fabricated narrative, a specialized tool designed exclusively to garner sympathy and extract constant financial resources from our parents. Yet here she was, weaponizing a non-existent fetus to violently deflect from a multi-million-dollar federal fraud case. Howard and Barbara reacted exactly as she had engineered. The crushing weight of their financial ruin evaporated instantly, replaced by the intoxicating high of their golden daughter's miraculous news. Howard fell to his knees beside her, wrapping his arms fiercely around her shaking shoulders. Barbara rushed over, crying genuine tears of profound relief, clutching Brittany's face in her hands. The offshore gambling, the fake vendor contracts, the impending foreclosure notices on the family estate, it all vanished entirely from their conscious minds. The golden narrative of their perfect family had been successfully restored. Brittany then turned her performance directly toward me. She looked up from the floor, her eyes narrowing with vicious, calculated malice. She pointed a shaking finger at my stomach. "How could you do this?" she screamed, her voice echoing with righteous, unhinged fury. "How could you sit there pregnant with your own child and intentionally render my baby homeless? How could you throw your true niece or nephew out onto the street just to satisfy your bitter, jealous vendetta?" She wept louder, clutching her flat stomach protectively. She accused me of plotting this entire corporate takeover specifically to destroy her sacred moment of maternal joy. She wailed that I was a cold, calculating monster who cared more about profit margins and forensic audits than the fundamental bond of family. She demanded to know how I could sleep at night, knowing I was actively attempting to ruin the life of an innocent unborn child. I did not blink. I did not offer a single word of rebuttal or defense. I let her hysterical, baseless accusations hang in the cold, climate-controlled air of the boardroom. Connor shifted his weight, his presence a solid, immovable barrier against their escalating lunacy. My legal team watched the display with detached, professional disgust. They had seen desperate debtors employ every conceivable tactic to avoid financial accountability, but weaponizing a fabricated pregnancy to secure a corporate bailout was a new low even for veteran litigators. Howard stood up, his posture suddenly reinflated with arrogant, aggressive defiance. He placed a protective hand on Brittany's shoulder and glared at me. His delusion was absolute, impenetrable, and highly destructive. He loudly declared that they did not need my dirty, vindictive money. He stated with unwavering, psychotic confidence that Spencer's logistics company was fundamentally sound, and that this minor temporary cash flow issue would be quickly resolved without submitting to my toxic, jealous demands. He turned to Barbara and Brittany, his voice booming with forced patriarchal authority. He commanded them to wipe their tears. He announced a new immediate battle plan right there in the boardroom. They were going to throw the most opulent, massive high society baby shower gala the city had ever seen. They would host it by the end of the current month. Howard insisted that projecting an image of immense, untouchable wealth was the ultimate key to attracting private high-net-worth investors. He declared they would bypass institutional lenders like Apex Capital entirely and secure the necessary capital directly from their elite social circle to replace the lost loan. He reasoned aloud that a lavish, highly publicized celebration of the family's new heir would perfectly mask their financial hemorrhaging. It was a strategy of pure, unadulterated madness. He was actively planning to finance a massive, fraudulent gala using corporate credit they did not possess, all to celebrate a pregnancy that did not exist in a desperate bid to attract investors to a tech company that was nothing more than an empty shell for an offshore gambling syndicate. Barbara vigorously agreed, her eyes lighting up with manic energy at the prospect of planning a high society event. She immediately began listing the prominent local politicians, minor celebrities, and wealthy venture capitalists she intended to invite. She loudly proclaimed that this baby shower would be the premier social event of the decade, a definitive public statement of the family's unbroken power, prestige, and generational wealth. Spencer remained entirely silent, hauling himself up from his chair with agonizing slowness. He looked physically ill, a gray pallor covering his face. He was entirely aware that Howard's insane gala plan would only accelerate their descent into federal prison by committing further wire fraud to fund the event. But he lacked the spine to confess the truth. He simply grabbed his monogrammed briefcase, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the carpet, and moved mechanically toward the exit. Howard supported Brittany as she stood up. They deliberately turned their backs on the forensic evidence still glowing brightly on the presentation screen. They marched toward the frosted glass doors, projecting a highly manufactured, unified front of righteous indignation and elite superiority. As Howard pulled the heavy door open, he turned back to face me one final time. His expression was twisted with pure, unfiltered contempt. He pointed his finger directly at my face, his voice ringing out with absolute toxic finality. "You are completely dead to us," he sneered. "We are going to build an empire for Brittany's child. And you can take comfort in the fact that your baby will never ever be a part of this real family." He slammed the boardroom door shut behind them. The heavy glass vibrated violently in its frame, then settled back into silence. I sat at the head of the mahogany table, listening to their rapid footsteps echo down the main corridor and fade entirely into the lobby. I looked down at the platinum business card still resting on the polished surface, then up at Marcus, my lead corporate counsel. The theatrical performance was over. The trap was entirely sealed. I gave Marcus a single, precise nod. I instructed him to file the accelerated debt collection notices immediately and execute the asset freezes before the end of the business day. I wanted every single one of their bank accounts locked down tight before they could even begin booking caterers for their fraudulent gala. The absolute financial chokehold was now firmly legally in place, and I was going to watch them suffocate entirely under the weight of their own magnificent, unyielding lies. The 3 weeks following the boardroom ambush were a masterclass in silent administrative execution. Marcus and my legal team operated with the lethal efficiency of a well-oiled machine, methodically filing injunctions, securing asset freezes, and formally calling in every single note of debt Spencer's holding company possessed. The financial chokehold tightened by the hour. I watched the data roll across my monitors, charting their absolute descent into insolvency. Yet true to their deeply pathological nature, Howard and Barbara entirely rejected the reality of their impending ruin. Instead of securing legal counsel or attempting to mitigate the catastrophic damage, they aggressively doubled down on their fabricated illusion. My forensic accounting team flagged a sudden, desperate flurry of liquidations originating from Howard's remaining personal accounts. They sold off his vintage car collection at a severe loss, pawned Barbara's prized heirloom jewelry, and took out a massive, highly predatory personal loan against the heavily leveraged equity of a vacation property they barely owned. They scraped together exactly $100,000 in untraceable cash. They did not use this money to retain a white-collar defense attorney for Spencer. They did not use it to pay the vendors Spencer had defrauded. They used every last cent to book the grand ballroom at the St. Regis Hotel. Their strategy was a spectacular display of unhinged, narcissistic delusion. Howard believed that by throwing an overwhelmingly lavish, high-society baby shower for Brittany's miracle pregnancy, he could project an aura of untouchable generational wealth. He intended to pack the room with prominent venture capitalists, private investors, and elite socialites, entirely convinced he could charm them into writing massive checks to replace the $3 million loan I had officially denied. He was using a fake baby to execute a desperate real-world Ponzi scheme. 2 days before the event, an email arrived in my personal inbox. It was from Barbara. The subject line was left blank. The message was short, dripping with the toxic, arrogant superiority she clung to like a life raft. She wrote that the family was finally celebrating a true blessing untouched by my bitter jealousy. She explicitly stated that Brittany was carrying the true heir to the family legacy, a child who would inherit the empire Spencer was building. She ended the email with a direct command: "Do not bother showing your face. You are not welcome." I printed the email, folded it neatly, and placed it inside my clutch. I had absolutely no intention of missing this party. The evening of the gala. Connor and I arrived at the St. Regis in the back of a sleek black town car. I wore a custom-tailored midnight blue evening gown that draped elegantly over my own very real, very present pregnancy. Connor looked imposing and flawless in a classic charcoal tuxedo. We did not look like desperate social climbers scrambling for capital. We looked like the apex predators who owned the building. We stepped out onto the red carpet, completely ignoring the valet, and walked directly through the revolving brass doors. The grand ballroom was a grotesque monument to financial fraud. Howard and Barbara had spared absolutely no expense utilizing stolen funds to create a blindingly opulent fantasy. Towering arrangements of rare white orchids dominated every table. A massive, intricately carved ice sculpture of a stork rested in the center of the room, surrounded by a tiered cascade of vintage champagne. A classical string quartet played softly in the corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the impending disaster. The room was packed with exactly the kind of wealthy, influential targets Howard had meticulously selected. They were sipping stolen champagne, completely oblivious to the fact that they were standing in the epicenter of a federal crime scene. Brittany was holding court near the front of the stage, glowing under the crystal chandeliers. She was wearing a form-fitting blush-pink maternity gown, explicitly chosen to highlight her physical state. Beneath the expensive silk, she sported a distinct, perfectly round, highly prominent 6-month bump. She rested her hands protectively over her stomach, accepting lavish gifts and gushing compliments from the wealthy investors Howard was actively circling. Spencer stood a few feet away, clutching a crystal tumbler of scotch. He looked entirely hollowed out, a sweaty, gray-faced hostage, forced to participate in his own public execution. Connor and I moved smoothly through the heavy mahogany doors and stepped onto the ballroom floor. The atmospheric shift was immediate. The ambient chatter in our immediate vicinity dropped off as guests registered our arrival. Barbara spotted me almost instantly from across the room. Her forced aristocratic smile violently shattered, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. She dropped her champagne flute onto a passing waiter's tray and frantically grabbed Howard's arm, pointing in my direction. Howard's face flushed a deep, dangerous red. He immediately signaled frantically to a pair of burly suited event security guards stationed near the main entrance, aggressively jabbing his finger toward me. The two guards moved to intercept us, their expressions serious and determined. Connor did not even break his stride. He stepped smoothly in front of me, squaring his broad shoulders and fixing the guards with a look of terrifying, absolute authority. He calmly reached into his tuxedo jacket, pulled out a thick laminated envelope bearing the official seal of the Federal District Court, and pressed it directly into the chest of the lead guard. The guard glanced down at the federal injunction, his eyes widening in sudden realization. He immediately stepped back, placing a hand on his partner's arm to stop him. They recognized instantly that they were entirely out of their depth, stepping aside to grant me unobstructed passage. I glided past the bewildered security detail and walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, parting the sea of high society guests. I bypassed Howard, who was practically vibrating with rage, and ignored Barbara's shrill, panicked demands for me to leave. I walked purposefully up the carpeted steps and took my position directly behind the main microphone stationed at the center of the raised stage. I tapped the microphone twice. The sharp, amplified sound echoed like a gunshot through the cavernous ballroom. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The low murmur of conversation instantly died away, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Hundreds of wealthy investors and socialites turned their undivided attention to the stage. I offered the silent room a cool, perfectly calibrated smile. My voice, when I spoke, was crystal clear, ringing with an absolute chilling authority that demanded total compliance. "Good evening, everyone," I announced, my gaze sweeping across the sea of confused faces before landing dead center on my family. I know my mother specifically requested my absence tonight. However, as the highly anticipated aunt-to-be, I simply could not miss the opportunity to stand before all of you and present my sister with a very special, profoundly necessary gift. Howard lunged forward toward the stage, his face twisted in a snarl. He screamed at the AV technicians to cut the microphone, violently waving his arms. He roared that I was a deranged, jealous woman trying to ruin a sacred family celebration. He desperately tried to signal the crowd to ignore me, sweating profusely through his tailored suit. I did not flinch. I raised my hand and snapped my fingers, signaling the heavy reinforced oak doors at the back of the ballroom. The doors swung violently inward, slamming loudly against the walls. Thomas, my private investigator, strode purposefully into the room. He was not dressed for a high society gala. He wore a utilitarian suit, and he was not alone. Flanking him with synchronized military precision were 6 severe, unsmiling individuals wearing dark windbreakers, bearing the bright yellow block letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service. A collective audible gasp rippled through the wealthy crowd. The elite investors instantly recognized the presence of federal agents. The atmosphere in the ballroom transformed from luxurious celebration to sheer, unadulterated terror. Howard froze mid-step, his jaw dropping open. Barbara let out a sharp, genuine scream, clutching the edge of a linen-draped table to keep from collapsing. Spencer dropped his scotch glass. It shattered spectacularly against the polished hardwood floor, sending shards of crystal and expensive liquor flying across the shoes of a prominent venture capitalist. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my tablet. I connected it seamlessly to the venue's master AV system with a single tap. The massive high-definition screen suspended above the stage, which had previously been displaying rotating generic images of baby toys and pink ribbons, abruptly went black. "My sister claims this event is a celebration of a miraculous new life," I stated, my voice dropping to a glacial, penetrating register. "But I believe in celebrating the truth." I pressed play. The massive screens flared to life, projecting crystal-clear, time-stamped security footage. The video showed a sterile, brightly lit private mail drop facility in downtown Seattle. The date stamp indicated the footage was captured exactly 10 days ago. The camera clearly showed Brittany walking up to the counter. She was wearing a tight athletic shirt, her stomach completely undeniably flat. The entire ballroom watched in stunned, breathless silence as the clerk handed Brittany a large, heavily taped cardboard box. The screen then split simultaneously, displaying the digital invoice and shipping manifest my team had intercepted. The invoice clearly listed the contents of the package: a theatrical-grade, highly realistic weighted silicone pregnancy prosthetic sized for a 6-month gestation purchased for $4,000. The video feed shifted to a different angle captured by a camera positioned outside the facility. It showed Brittany walking to her car. She placed the box in the passenger seat, opened it, and pulled out the large, flesh-colored silicone dome. The high-definition footage captured her explicitly unbuttoning her shirt, strapping the heavy silicone rig around her waist, and adjusting her clothing to perfectly conceal the straps. She then turned sideways, admiring her newly manufactured, entirely fake baby bump in the reflection of her car window. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, broken only by the sound of Brittany letting out a low, animalistic whimper. She instinctively crossed her arms over her chest, frantically trying to hide the silicone prosthetic strapped beneath her expensive silk gown. But the visual evidence burning brightly on the massive screens above her head made the gesture entirely futile. I stepped away from the podium and looked directly at the crowd of wealthy investors Howard had intended to con. "There is no baby," I announced, the absolute finality of my words echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "My sister is wearing a silicone prosthetic purchased to manipulate you into providing capital. Furthermore, I have instructed the federal agents currently securing the exits to impound the financial records of this specific event." I turned my glacial gaze toward Spencer, who was now trembling so violently he looked as though he might seize. "The $100,000 spent on this champagne, these orchids, and this ballroom was not funded by family wealth," I declared, delivering the final catastrophic financial blow. "It was wired directly from a fraudulent shell account, originally established to pay the employee payroll of Spencer's logistics company. You are currently drinking champagne purchased with stolen wages facilitated by a man actively running an illegal offshore gambling syndicate." The fallout was instantaneous and explosive. The high society guests did not hesitate. The investors Howard had spent weeks courting dropped their glasses, turned their backs, and surged en masse toward the exits, desperate to distance themselves from a massive, active federal crime scene. The federal agents fanned out across the room, moving swiftly to secure the event organizers and lock down the venue. Howard stood completely paralyzed in the center of the emptying ballroom, watching his entire fabricated empire burn to the ground in real time. The crystal chandeliers suspended high above the St. Regis Grand Ballroom seemed to physically rattle as the sheer volume of panic filled the massive space. High-net-worth investors, venture capitalists, and prominent socialites were not merely walking toward the exits. They were executing a frantic, highly coordinated tactical retreat. Dozens of phones were instantly pressed against ears. I could hear the sharp, overlapping commands echoing across the room as wealthy individuals barked orders to their private wealth managers and corporate attorneys, demanding the immediate total divestment from anything remotely associated with Spencer's holding company. The classical string quartet had completely abandoned their instruments, shrinking back against the velvet-lined walls, in sheer terror to avoid being trampled by the stampede of fleeing millionaires. The carefully constructed, immensely expensive facade of generational wealth had evaporated in a matter of seconds, leaving behind nothing but the raw, ugly reality of a collapsing Ponzi scheme. Brittany stood entirely rooted to the polished hardwood of the stage, her hands desperately clutching the sides of her blush-pink maternity gown. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her expensive spray tan looking unnatural and garish under the bright, unforgiving spotlights. The crushing realization that she was permanently exiled from the elite society she worshipped was breaking her mind in real time. She locked eyes with the federal agents advancing rapidly down the center aisle and panicked completely. Operating on pure selfish instinct, she hiked up the heavy silk skirt of her gown and bolted toward the service doors located behind the main stage. She did not make it far. Spencer, driven by the absolute cowardly terror of a cornered rat facing decades in federal prison, intercepted her. He grabbed her violently by the arm and shoved her forcefully backward to clear his own path to the rear exit. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with hysteria, telling the advancing federal agents that the entire fraud was Brittany's idea. He pointed a shaking accusatory finger at his wife, sobbing wildly that she had psychologically forced him to steal the corporate money to fund her pathological shopping addiction and had actively demanded he help fake the pregnancy to legally trap her parents' wealth. The sheer force of Spencer's violent, desperate shove sent Brittany crashing hard into the massive ice sculpture of the stork. The collision was catastrophic. As her back hit the freezing carved surface, the heavy $4,000 silicone prosthetic strapped tightly to her abdomen violently shifted. The securing belt stressed by her sudden movement, and the impact snapped completely under the pressure. The massive flesh-colored dome slipped entirely down her torso. It bulged grotesquely and unnaturally sideways under the expensive silk fabric of her gown, eventually resting awkwardly against her left hip. A collective gasp of absolute unfiltered revulsion erupted from the remaining guests, who had paused near the exits to watch the spectacle. The physical evidence of her sociopathic deception was now undeniable. She was standing on a brightly lit stage, with a fake stomach hanging by her hip, permanently searing her ultimate humiliation into the minds of every powerful socialite and investor in the city. The federal agents did not care about the shifting silicone prosthetic or the shattered ice raining down on the stage. They moved with swift, tactical precision, bypassing the sobbing Brittany entirely to swarm Spencer. Two heavily armed agents grabbed his arms, pulling them sharply behind his back and slamming him roughly against the mahogany paneling of the stage. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly over the ambient chaos of the room. The lead agent, a tall woman with a completely unreadable clinical expression, read Spencer his Miranda rights, while simultaneously listing the primary federal charges loud enough for the entire room to hear. Federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, aggravated identity theft, money laundering. Spencer's legs gave out entirely. He collapsed into a pathetic weeping heap, completely unable to support his own weight. The agents were forced to physically drag him across the ballroom floor by his armpits. His expensive, aggressively tailored pinstripe suit bunched awkwardly around his shoulders as they hauled him out the main double doors, his wailing apologies fading into the heavy silence of the hotel lobby. Howard and Barbara were left standing completely alone in the center of the ruined gala. The silence that followed Spencer's forced removal was heavy, toxic, and suffocating. Barbara had sunk into a velvet chair, staring blankly at the shattered crystal and spilled vintage champagne, permanently staining the expensive carpet. Her mind simply refused to process the absolute destruction of her social standing. Howard's arrogant, patriarchal posture was completely gone. His broad shoulders slumped forward, his chest caved in, and the false, aggressive vitality he had projected for decades had been entirely drained from his body. He looked up at me, standing tall on the stage, with Connor remaining an immovable fortress at my side. Howard's eyes were bloodshot and wide with a desperate, pathetic realization. He finally understood the true architecture of the trap. He recognized that he possessed absolutely zero leverage, no capital, and no future. He slowly walked toward the edge of the stage, his legs trembling visibly under his slacks. Then the arrogant patriarch, who had demanded my absolute obedience for 30 years, the man who had called me a failure only hours prior, collapsed entirely onto his knees. He looked up at me, hot tears streaming freely down his face, his hands clasped together in a desperate begging gesture. His voice was a broken, humiliating whisper that cracked with raw terror. He begged me to use Apex Capital to save the family estate. He pleaded that I owed it to the family name, to his legacy, to issue the bailout funds. He promised wildly that he would do whatever it took, sign any contract, submit to any demand, if I would just stop the impending foreclosure and save them from living on the streets. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical sense of profound finality. I stepped to the very edge of the stage, looking directly into his terrified, desperate eyes. I delivered the final fatal blow with perfect, unhurried articulation. "I already bought the debt on your mansion, Dad," I stated, my voice completely devoid of empathy. I did not need to issue a bridge loan because I utilized a subsidiary shell corporation to purchase the massive defaulted secondary mortgages on your estate directly from your desperate lenders. I own the paper. I watched his breath catch painfully in his throat as the legal reality hit him. The official eviction notice goes up on your front door on Monday morning. I continued, ensuring every word landed with devastating precision. And you should know, I am not seizing the property to live in it, and I am not flipping it for a profit. I have already secured the permits. I am tearing your mansion down to the foundation next month to build a heavily subsidized community arts center. Your hollow legacy is officially terminated. I turned my back on my weeping father and walked out of the St. Regis Grand Ballroom, my hand resting securely in Connor's. We did not look back. 6 months later, the landscape of our lives had fundamentally, permanently shifted. The federal court system moved with crushing, unrelenting efficiency. Spencer had taken a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial and was currently serving a 15-year sentence in a medium-security federal penitentiary, his fabricated tech empire officially reduced to a cautionary tale taught in corporate ethics seminars. Brittany was entirely bankrupt, both financially and socially. The high society friends she had bought with stolen corporate money had instantly blacklisted her the moment the fake pregnancy footage hit the local news. Without Spencer's fraudulent income or Howard's rapidly evaporating wealth to support her delusions, she was forced to move into a cramped, poorly ventilated studio apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. She currently worked 30 hours a week, folding synthetic clothes at a fast fashion retail chain in a dying mall. She spent her designated 15-minute breaks hiding in the stockroom, desperately avoiding the pitying, mocking stares of former acquaintances who recognized her. Howard and Barbara fared no better. The demolition of the family estate had proceeded exactly as scheduled, the heavy machinery reducing their monument of false wealth to a flat plot of dirt in a matter of days. They now occupied a tiny, heavily mortgaged 2-bedroom apartment that smelled faintly of boiled cabbage, drowning in massive legal debts from Spencer's fallout. They were completely permanently ostracized from the country club circles they had once ruled with toxic authority. Their parasitic ecosystem had been entirely eradicated. I sat comfortably in the pristine, sunlit environment of a private maternal suite at the downtown hospital. The ambient, chaotic sounds of the city traffic were completely muffled by the heavy, soundproof glass windows. Connor sat in the plush armchair directly beside my hospital bed, his face lit with a profound, quiet joy that required absolutely no translation. Resting securely against my chest was our healthy, beautiful newborn daughter. Her small hands curled peacefully against her soft pink blanket. She was perfect. The room smelled of fresh, clean linen and the soft, vibrant scent of the white orchids Connor had brought that morning. I reached over to the bedside table and picked up my secure phone. The screen automatically woke up, displaying a single blocked voicemail notification that had bypassed my primary filters. The automated transcript software quickly translated the audio into text. It was Barbara. The transcript showed she was crying hysterically, begging for a chance to visit the hospital, pleading to see her grandbaby, and making wildly empty promises that things could be different now that we could finally be a real family. I stared at the glowing transcript for a fraction of a second. I felt no lingering anger, no residual sorrow, and absolutely no sense of familial obligation. With a single, effortless, definitive swipe of my thumb, I deleted the message permanently without ever listening to the audio. I placed the phone face down on the table, closed my eyes, and leaned my head back against the soft pillows. I listened to the steady, rhythmic breathing of my husband and my newborn child. I had successfully, permanently severed the toxic roots of my past, and my life was finally completely filled with absolute peace, genuine love, and total, unbreakable freedom.